A Game for Heroes by Jack Higgins, read by Christopher Lee. It was unbelievably warm for the time of year, and the war had ceased to exist for me. It was almost over anyway. I swam towards the spear of rock, climbed out, and rested for a while. Mary sat at her easel halfway along the beach, an old straw hat shading her from the sun. I dived in and started to swim for the shore. She was waiting for me, a towel ready in one hand, my eye patch in the other. I dried my face, pulled on the patch, and grinned. "Marvellous out there, you should try it." "No, thanks. Ask me again around July. And don't be long, Owen." She gave me a light kiss on the forehead, and I watched her start up the path. We'd met as students before the war, and when they'd carried me into that military hospital in Surrey 5 months previously, pumped full of drugs and barely conscious, hers had been the first face I'd seen on waking. Her husband had been killed in action, navigating a Lancaster in the Dresden raid. We'd been living together for 3 months now, ever since my discharge from hospital. I took my time about dressing, then walked across to the easel. She'd only got as far as the sketching stage with this one, but it was good. I lay down on the sand and pillowed my head in my hands. I must have slept, but only briefly. A gull cried harshly, bringing me back to life. I was instantly awake, a habit hard come by in dark places, and got to my feet. If I didn't look sharp, there would be Mary seeking me, the dinner burning, and the devil to pay. I started up the path. A voice called, "You down there!" I glanced up, squinting into the sun, and saw an American Army officer standing on the brow of the hill. "I want a word with you," he said. Fine Bostonian tones, the kind of voice you get in New England, and usually from a member of that happy little band whose ancestors stampeded to be first ashore from the Mayflower. He spoke again. "I'm looking for Colonel Morgan. They told me at the house that he would be down on the beach. Have you seen him?" I could find every excuse for him. He was gazing down on a small, dark man, badly in need of a shave, and the old blue Guernsey sweater and the black eye patch didn't help. And neither, I suppose, did the gold ring I was wearing in my left ear at the insistence of Jack Trelawney, the landlord of the Queen's Arms up the road towards Falmouth, who believed implicitly that it would improve my sight. He was a major, which wasn't surprising when one considered his medals, DSC and Silver Star with oak leaf clusters for a second award. When he came a little closer so that I could read the shoulder flash, I saw that he was a ranger, and I've always heard that there was little to choose between them and our own commandos. "Have you seen him?" he demanded patiently. "Well, now, that would be a difficult question to answer," I said in a fair to middling Cornish accent. "You'd better buck up your ideas then, hadn't you?" The hard Scots voice came as something of a surprise, as did the hand that grabbed me by the shoulder and swung me round. Another ranger, a master sergeant this time, which made the Scots accent all the more intriguing. He had a raw, bony face and hard eyes. I placed a hand on the hand that held me, twisted and dropped to one knee. He rolled 20 feet down the hill into a gorse bush. I looked up at the major and smiled gently. He made a mistake. Don't let him make another. Before he could say anything, the master sergeant was coming back up the slope with the speed of a wounded bear. When he was about 6 feet away, my hand came out of my hip pocket holding the old spring-blade gutting knife. Blade jumped into view. He stopped dead in his tracks, then crouched and started to move close. "Grant, stay where you are. That's an order." The major cut in crisply. Then another voice called, high and clear. "Owen, for heaven's sake! What on earth's going on down there?" The man who hurried down the track was in his 60s, with snow-white hair, long, rather ugly face, and steel-rimmed spectacles. He wore an old Burberry and carried an umbrella, and resembled to a remarkable degree the public image of an Oxford Don, which was exactly what he had been when we first met. I put up my knife and groaned, "Oh, no, no, not you, Henry, anything but that." Major Edward Arnold Fitzgerald and his Highland American bully boy moved stiffly away after Henry's formal introduction, and I shook my head. The trouble with Fitzgerald's kind is that they can never take a man as they find him. Henry's eyebrows went up. "But, my dear Owen, that is precisely what he did do. I should have thought it unlikely that there is more than one half-colonel in His Majesty's service at the moment sporting a gold ring in his left ear." "How's the war going?" I asked. I understand the 1st Commando Brigade reached Lüneburg yesterday. We sat on an outcrop of rock, and he produced a tin of a rather exotic Turkish cigarette he favoured and offered me one. "All right, Henry, let's get down to it. What do you want?" "It's quite simple, really," he said. "We've got a job for you." I laughed. "You've got to be joking. The war's over. It can't last more than another couple of months in Europe." "On the mainland, yes, but the Channel Islands could prove to be something else again." I frowned, and he held up a hand. "No, let me explain. For some months now, Naval Force 135 has been preparing Operation Nest Egg, the liberation of the Channel Islands, but it's an operation that is planned to take place only when the German garrison has surrendered. It's our hope that it will not be necessary for us to fight our way ashore." "And you think they might still try to hold out after defeat in Europe?" "Well, let's put it this way. Vice Admiral Hofmeier, the commander in the Channel Islands, seems to show every intention of going down fighting. On the night of March the 8th, he mounted a commando raid of his own and attacked Granville with 2 minesweepers. They destroyed 3 ships and a hell of a lot of dockside equipment into the bargain. When Dönitz congratulated him, Hofmeier signalled that he had every hope of being able to hang on in the Channel Islands for another year. So what am I supposed to do about it?" "Go home, Owen," he said. "Go back to Saint-Pierre. I'd have thought you would have enjoyed that." Saint-Pierre is the most outlying of the Channel Islands and 4th in size. During the 1850s, the British government was alarmed by the development by the French of a strong naval base at Cherbourg. A similar scheme was mounted in Saint-Pierre. A breakwater was constructed to enlarge the harbour at Charlottetown, and 4 naval forts were built at various points on the coast. The labour force, as far as Saint-Pierre was concerned, was imported from South Wales, which accounts for the fact that my father, and I following him, had a name like Owen Morgan, although my mother had been born Antoinette Roselle and spoke French for preference to me until the day she died. Standing there now on the Cornish cliffs, I stared out to sea southwest to Brittany beyond the horizon to the Golfe de Saint-Malo and Saint-Pierre, and for the briefest of moments, a fugue in time, I saw again a young girl, skin browned by summer's heat, long hair flying as she ran from the barefoot fisher boy. Simone. I could almost reach out and touch her. Instead, a hand on my arm brought me back to life. I turned and found Henry at my side, a slight quizzical frown on his face. "Will you go, Owen?" He produced a buff envelope from his inside pocket, took out a letter and handed it to me. "When I discussed it with him, I did point out that there was always the possibility you might feel you'd done your share." The letter was from Downing Street, hand-written, and bore the usual signature. It informed me that I was returned to the active list forthwith, and must consider myself to be under the order of Section D and Professor Henry Brandon, in connection with Operation Grande Pierre. The letter was stamped, "Action this day." I sat down on the rock beside him. "All right, Henry, you better tell me about it." "According to our information, the island's been reasonably heavily fortified," Henry said. "Mainly artillery units and pioneers." "How many?" "We think 600. "How many islanders?" "Most of the population, as you know, chose to be evacuated to England in 1940, just before the occupation." 60 or so stayed," I said, "including the seigneur and his daughter." "Ah, yes. Henri de Beaumarchais. He's dead, it seems, killed in the naval bombardment." "Dead? Henri de Beaumarchais? What naval bombardment?" "Ours, last year. His daughter's apparently still there, but almost everyone else was moved out 6 months back." "She will be seigneur now," I said. "Lord of Saint-Pierre." "Well, the thing is," Henry said, "we're losing rather a lot of ships in the Channel area, starting 6 months ago. Quite a shock when we discovered what it was." "Secret weapons at this stage of the war?" "A lethal little item called blackjack, which they used with some success at Anzio." "And now they're trying it in the Channel?" That's about the size of it, yes. All they've done is to take a normal torpedo, scoop out the warhead, and fix controls. There's a glass cupola to protect the operator who sits astride the thing with a live torpedo slung underneath. The general idea is to point it to the target, release the second torpedo at the last minute, and try to swerve out of the way. Where do they get the men to play that kind of game? The Brandenburg Division, mainly. They seem to have provided the nearest thing the Germans have to our own commandos. And you think they're operating from Saint-Pierre? Until 3 weeks ago, at least. You're certain of that? We've got someone who was there, until then, who says so. A man called Joseph Saint-Martin. He turned up on the French coast near Granville in an open boat. Says he knows you. Oh, yes, he knows me all right. I touched the bridge of my nose gently where the bone showed crooked. Henry said softly, "As a matter of interest, I've got him up at the house now." I frowned. "You're moving fast, aren't you?" "No other choice. You must go in the day after tomorrow. The Navy tells me that if we miss that particular tide, conditions won't be right for another 3 weeks. Now, let me get this straight. The general purpose of this affair is for me to get ashore, find out as much as I can about the Black Jack operation, and get off again, presumably during the same night. Well, that's about the size of it, yes. And you really think that this is important, Henry, at this stage in the war?" He held up the famous letter. "Government evidently does." "And what about Fitzgerald? Where does he fit in?" "He's a good man, Owen, decorated 3 times. He's been on the staff of the 21st Specialist Service Raiding Force for the past couple of years. They're a mixed bunch. American Rangers, French and British commandos. And what's he supposed to do?" Fitzgerald and 5 companions were to enter the harbour at Charlottetown in 2-man Rob Roy canoes. The intention was to fix limpet mines on everything in sight, and to get out again without being discovered. "May I ask who is in command?" "Well, you are, by virtue of seniority, but no situation is likely to arise in which you need to exercise such authority. You will land alone, and you will have your own task to perform. Major Fitzgerald and his men will look after themselves." He stood up and rubbed his hands together. "And now for a spot of the excellent lunch Mrs. Barton and your Daly were preparing. She gave us 40 minutes. "Not me." I shook my head. "I'll stay down here for a while. I want to think. There's one thing you can do. Send down Joe Saint-Martin." Joe Saint-Martin stopped about 5 yards away. "Owen, is that you?" I didn't say a word, and he shook his head in a kind of wonder. "Colonel, they tell me you are." "That's right," I said. He grinned suddenly, the same old familiar leering grin. Little Owen Morgan. I'd never have recognized you." "Never mind," I said. "They tell me you were on the island until 3 weeks ago. Tell me about it." "Not much to tell." He shrugged. "I saw my chance of skipping in a fishing boat and took it. I knew most of Brittany was in Allied hands now, see?" "How did you know?" "Oh, Ezra told me. Ezra Scully. Kept his radio right through the occupation. Listened to the BBC regular. I understand that most of the locals moved to Guernsey 6 months ago." "That's right. It was after they went that the frogmen moved in." "Why were you kept on?" He shrugged. "They needed a couple of pilots for the harbour and the passage. You know what the coursier can be like." "So they kept you and Ezra?" "That's it." "Who else?" "Jethro Hughes is still on his farm with his son Justin, and old Dr. Riley. They kept him because they don't have enough army doctors to go round." "And the seigneur?" "Killed in the shelling last year, but she's still there, Simone. She's seigneur now." "Is that why they've allowed her to stay?" "Maybe, I don't know." He shrugged. "Whore would be a better name for her. Her and her fancy man, Steiner. Seigneur? Jerry bag, more like." "What are you talking about?" Simone, this fancy man of hers, Steiner. Sergeant Major, that's all he is, but they treat him like he was the Führer himself." "You're lying," I said. "Lying, is it? I've seen them plenty of times, I can tell you, and they're posing for him with nothing on, and there's a sight for you, believe me." Then he remembered, and a slow, sly grin seeped across his face. "I was forgetting, wasn't I? You was sweet on her." He started to laugh, and gave me the old, half-contemptuous dig in the shoulder that I remembered so well from boyhood. I slapped him hard across the face. "People don't really change, Joe, do they? You always had a foul mouth." He came in with a rush, intent on the kind of beating he'd been fond of handing out in the old days. But times had changed. My right foot caught him in the groin. He doubled over with a cry, and my knee lifted into his face, straightening him again. He lay on his back, knees up, writhing in agony. I turned and found Master Sergeant Grant coming down the path. "The lady sent me down, Colonel. She says if you want to eat, you'd better come now." I nodded towards Saint-Martin. "Stay with our friend there till he can walk, and then bring him up. We've still some talking to do." I was sitting on the veranda rail, lighting a cigarette, when Henry entered with Saint-Martin. He looked pale and ill, and there was hatred in his eyes. I asked Henry to get the maps. There was an Admiralty chart of the general area of the Golfe de Saint-Malo, and a pre-war ordnance survey map of Saint-Pierre. I pulled the wicker chair forward to the table and motioned Saint-Martin into it. "I'm going to ask you some questions now, and I want clear and accurate answers, understand?" He nodded. The picture which emerged was a reasonably gloomy one. All beaches were mined, which was only to be expected, and a landing of any sort seemed impossible. "Only one place I can think of." He stabbed his fingers at the peninsula that jutted into the sea in the southeast corner of the island. "The Devil's Staircase? You could do it if the tide was right, and it ought to be." "But the cliffs must be 300 feet high at that point," Henry said. Saint-Martin nodded. "That's why they haven't any defences there. Don't reckon they need none." I explained quickly to Henry. At low tide it wouldn't be possible, but a 25-foot rise puts you level with a hole in the cliff face that takes you into a fissure inside going all the way up. I moved on to discuss the exact location of each of the civilians still left on the island. Dr. Riley was living in the town, and Ezra Scully still resided in his old cottage by the lifeboat station at Granville, on the south side of the island. "And Miss de Beaumarchais?" I asked. "At the Seigneurie, at the manor house, as always." "What about the frogmen?" "Oh, they moved in about 5 months ago, after most of the islanders had gone to Guernsey. There was 30 of them when they first came." "Who's in charge?" "Sergeant Major Steiner." "Well, tell me about him." "Even the governor, the old general, used to treat him with kid gloves. And he was SS." "What's so special about him?" "I don't know. To start with, he just doesn't give a damn for anyone. Spends half his time sketching and painting all over the island and speaks English better than you do. One of the pioneer corporals once told me he'd been to college in London, that his father, no, his stepfather, that was it, was a big man back home." I turned to Henry. "There was a Manfred Steiner at the Slade from 1935 to 1937, he said. "He was born in 1916, and his father was killed in the last year of the war. Prussian family, the kind who usually go into the army. His mother married again when he was 10, a man called Otto Furst." "Furst, the industrialist, the arms manufacturer?" I asked. "Yeah, that's him." He shook his head. "It's this Sergeant Major thing that I find so puzzling." And he was right. Considering Steiner's background, it was all wrong, but there was little to be gained from any further discussion, and I moved on to other things. The governor, old General Muller, had been killed in some kind of accident about a week before Saint-Martin had fled, which had left his chief aide, an SS colonel called Radl, as acting governor. Saint-Martin had plenty to say about him, the word swine figuring largely in his description. I went back into the house, taking the maps with me. Fitzgerald was standing at the window. "How does a Highland Scot come to be in the American Army?" I asked. "Grant," he shrugged. "He was a regular soldier in your own army for a while, Scots Guards. Took out American nationality just before the war." "Is he any good?" "A first-rate fighting man," he said. I half-filled a tumbler with whiskey and carried it over to the table as Henry appeared. "Right. Now let's get down to it. I'll have a look at your orders now, Major." He produced them without a murmur, and I read them through briefly. They stressed that my mission was to take precedence over his, that on no account was he to land or to look for unnecessary trouble, and that in any extreme situation he was to turn to me for orders. "You've read this thoroughly and understand it?" He nodded. "Perfectly." I settled then. I turned to Henry. "When do you want me to come up to town?" "No need for that, Owen. Falmouth tomorrow night. I'll send a car. You'll leave at noon the following day." It was usual to go on board the depot ship of the 15th MGB flotilla at Falmouth around noon on the great day, and one transferred to the operational gunboat 5 minutes before sailing time. It was strange to be in uniform again, but at least it earned me the commander's cabin for the trip. The commander was a lieutenant of about my own age called Dobson. He had a thin, rather reckless face, and he wore his cap Mountbatten style. "Nice to have you aboard, sir. Have a word with you later, if I may. Like to get under way now." A few moments later, the great diesel engines rumbled into life and we started to move. There was a tap on the door, and Fitzgerald came in. "A briefing at 2100 hours. Is that acceptable, sir?" he asked. "I should imagine so." He hesitated as if about to say something, and then withdrew, but I had other things to think about, and lay back on the bunk, head pillowed in my hands, staring up at the bulkhead above my head. I drifted into sleep, and when I wakened again it was 7:30. I got up, opened my hold-all, took out denim pants, my old Guernsey, canvas rope-soled boots, a reefer coat that my father had worn round the horn, under sail, and an old boatswain's cap with a broken peak. I changed quickly and examined myself in the mirror. The handgun I took out of the hold-all was a Mauser, with the SS bulbous silencer, a weapon much favoured by the Gestapo, one of whose members had provided it. I pushed it into the inside breast pocket of my reefer coat, put my knife in the right pocket, my rubber torch in the left, and went out. I met the chief petty officer on his way down the companionway. Navy to the hilt, he didn't turn a hair at my appearance. He saluted smartly. "Captain's compliments, sir. He'd take it as a privilege if you'd join him on the bridge." There was no moon, but white caps gleamed faintly through the darkness on either side. When I went onto the bridge, Dobson turned to greet me, his head disembodied in the light from the chart table. "Good of you to come up, sir. Thought we might have a look at the charts together. Major Fitzgerald's already here." Fitzgerald moved out of the shadows. He was dressed for action in waterproof smock and trousers, and his face had been darkened with camouflage cream. He didn't speak, but accepted a cigarette when I offered him one. "I understand you're something of an old hand on this run, sir," Dobson said. I nodded. "How's the E-boat situation?" I asked. "Oh, it's still pretty active." We discussed the run-in, the plan involving the pickup, and I gave him some useful information about conditions in the area generally. He tapped his fingers on the pinnacles, half a mile northwest of the harbour entrance. "Oh, they look like something to steer clear of." "The worst reef on the whole of North Atlantic seaboard. A death trap," I said. I went outside and stood at the rail staring into the darkness, thinking about Simone and what lay ahead, but mainly about Simone. I moved back into the wheelhouse, and Dobson appeared. "Turning the silencer on now, sir," Dobson said, which meant that we were approximately 30 miles from our destination, for there was a standard drill on these occasions. At 15 miles the main engines would go completely, and we would proceed in silence on the auxiliaries. At half a mile I would be offloaded and taken the rest of the way in a surf boat. Dobson checked his watch. "Final briefing just coming out, sir. I arranged with Major Fitzgerald to use the wardroom. Shall we go below?" It was all very regimental. They stood by their canoes at attention, weighted down with equipment exactly as they would go in at 0 hour, hard, tough, competent fighting men. Each man wore a camouflaged waterproof smock and trousers, knitted commando cap, and carried a Thompson submachine gun, grenades, commando knife, and various bits of miscellaneous equipment about the person. The limpet mines were carried in carefully partitioned canvas bags, one to a canoe. I said to Fitzgerald, "I'm glad they're on my side, Major." He was pleased. "Thank you, sir." "They're familiar with the provisions of the Kommando Befehl?" "Perfectly." "Fair enough." I turned to the men. "Just so you realize, it's odds-on to a bullet in the back of the head if they get their hands on you." When we stopped, there was nothing to be seen of the island, which was as it should be, and when they put the surf boat over, I was feeling surprisingly cheerful. I was being taken in by the midshipman who was called Varley and a tough old seaman named Dawson. They went over the side and waited for me, and Dobson checked his watch. "Right, sir, off you go then. Best of British." He shook hands and saluted formally, and Fitzgerald loomed out of the darkness. "Good luck, Colonel." After a bit I could hear the surf, and then quite suddenly, as if a veil had been lifted, I could see phosphorescence and clouds of white spray shining through the darkness. I checked the compass again and tapped Varley on the shoulder. "Straight in. Then I'll see what I can remember." The current had us now. Water slapping against the hull, and there were rocks standing jaggedly above white water. We slipped in among them like a wraith, and drifted no more than a couple of yards from the cliff face. It had been a long time, a hell of a long time, and yet there are things one can never forget. I could hear a strange hollow groaning, the distinctive voice of the bore-hole that lay at the bottom of the Devil's Staircase, and tapped Varley on the shoulder again, giving him directions. There was room for us to drift inside, but only by bending our heads. Varley and Dawson steadied the surf-boat, and I switched on my torch and stood up. The ledge I sought was a couple of feet above my head. Varley held the torch for me, and I pulled myself up. He handed me the torch, and then a one-man inflatable dinghy, neatly packaged. He smiled. "Best of luck, sir. We'll be back dead on time, I promise you." A slight scraping sound, a splash from the oars, and they were gone. I found a suitable crevasse well above high water mark, pushed the inflatable dinghy inside, and then took stock of the situation. The jagged shaft vanished into total darkness above me. I'd climbed it first as a boy of 14, as part of a kind of island ritual that was supposed to prove whether you had guts or not. The difference now was that for a great deal of the time I must climb in darkness. I flashed the torch upwards, tried to memorize what lay ahead, and then put it in my pocket and started. I climbed steadily for 10 or 15 minutes, and the hollow booming of the sea faded, and I was quite alone. The final 50 or 60 feet were the worst by far, for at that point the shaft became vertical, and in places it was only possible to progress by wedging between the sides and moving a foot at a time. I could smell the cold air again now, and rain drifted down in a fine spray, and when I glanced up there was a lighter patch in the darkness and a glint of a star. A moment later my hands had a grip on the rim of the exit hole, and I hauled myself out. I crouched on a small ledge and took in several lungfuls of good fresh air. 300 feet below, the surf was a smear of white, and above, stars glittered through holes in the clouds. I took the Mauser from my pocket and secured it to the spring clip at the rear of my belt, and then I started to make my way up a gently sloping fissure of rock to the cliff top. I paused on the edge, my hands digging into wet turf. I got to my feet, peering into the darkness, took a first step forward and tripped headlong over a strand of barbed wire, and alarm canisters started to rattle on either side of me. Joe Saint-Martin had betrayed me. Either that, or the wire defense system at that point had been erected within the past 3 weeks, which didn't seem probable. My heavy reefer coat had saved me from being shredded, but I was securely hooked. As I started to free myself, a door banged. There was a brief flash of light, and then it closed. The voices, when they sounded, were German. "Who goes there? Stand and declare yourself." I pulled myself free, the alarm canisters rattling again as I slid backwards towards the edge of the cliff. A torch beam picked me out of the darkness, and I got my hands up fast. No, for pity's sake, don't shoot. I'm only a fisherman, a simple fisherman, that's all." I gave it to them in French, with a strong Breton accent. In halting French, I was asked to explain myself. I said that I was a fisherman from Pointe-du-Château on the Brittany coast. The engine of my boat had broken down. I had drifted and had finally come to grief on the rocks at the bottom of the cliffs. I started to lower my hands and was sharply reminded to keep them raised. I could hear a metallic rustling as a section of the wire was rolled back, a solid curse or two in good Saxon German, as someone pricked himself. A moment later, he was beside me. He found nothing, for my knife was concealed in the palm of my right hand, which was raised with its fellow obediently over my head, and even an expert might have missed the Mauser on its clip at the small of my back. He took out the torch, pressed the button, and indicated the path through the wire. We walked no more than 10 yards, and went down steps to a concrete observation post. That settled it. Saint-Martin must have known. This thing had obviously been built for several years. "Open the door!" I did as I was told and went down 3 steps into the lighted bunker. I turned and faced my captors. The one in front was middle-aged with grey hair and steel glasses, an artilleryman from his uniform. The one behind him had hard eyes and an old bullet scar on the side of the face. He hung his machine pistol on a peg near the door and took out a cigarette. The man with the steel spectacles held my torch in one hand and a rifle in the other. He poked me with the barrel and grinned. "Hands high! Come on, get him up!" He prodded me again. I started to raise my hands, sprung the blade of the gutting knife, and stabbed him under the chin, the blade shearing up through the roof of the mouth into the brain, killing him instantly. He lurched to one side, and the other man grabbed for his machine pistol with a curse. The Mauser with the SS bulbous silencer was already in my left hand, and I shot him through the heart. It was about 10 seconds later that the field telephone rang. I lifted the phone, muffled the speaker slightly with one hand, and said in German, "Hello?" A voice crackled faintly along a bad line. "Muller, that you? Weber here. Everything in order?" "Everything's fine," I said. "Good. See you in the morning." I retrieved my knife, cleaned it, and put it away together with a torch. Then I turned my attention to the bodies on the floor. I took the one with steel spectacles first, hoisted him over my shoulders, went outside, and threw him over the cliffs. Then I returned for his friend. I replaced the wire, masking the way through, went back into the bunker and checked the floor. There was a small amount of blood, and I got a damp cloth from the lavatory and swabbed it up. From the sound of that phone call, there was an excellent chance that the post would not be visited until morning. There was a bicycle in the porch outside, and it gave me an idea. The sentries' greatcoats hung behind the door. I took one, stuffed my boatswain's cap into its pocket, and tried on a steel helmet that lay on the table. It was a couple of sizes too large for me, which was all to the good, and I left quickly, got the bicycle, and wheeled it along the track. A few moments later, the feel of the track beneath my feet seemed to change, and when I switched on the hooded bicycle lamp, I discovered why. It had been surfaced with tar macadam. I mounted the bicycle and rode away. It was a little over a mile to the seigneurie, and I didn't come across a soul. I passed the airstrip and turned into the Granville road. I went down the hill, my stomach hollow. A few 100 yards, that was all. A few 100 yards to Simone. How would she react? I came around a corner and found the seigneurie below in the hollow among the beech trees, and there were lights in the courtyard. Something was very wrong indeed. There were at least 3 field cars down there, and a limousine, and there was a sentry at the bottom of the steps leading up to the porched entrance, the Nazi flag hanging from a pole above him. Joe Saint-Martin again. There would have to be a reckoning there. I cycled past the front gate and kept on going. Granville lay below me in the darkness, a hamlet of no more than 12 or 15 cottages clustered round the old lifeboat station. Granville, where, according to Joe Saint-Martin, Ezra Scully lived on alone. Had he lied about that also? I came to the first house, dismounted, and left the bicycle behind a hedge. It was a village of the dead. Nothing lived here. I moved on cautiously. Ezra's cottage was behind the lifeboat shed. I paused, for I could see a chink of light at one of his windows, hear muffled laughter. I crouched at the windows by his front door and peered through a crack between the curtains. He sat on the far side of the table, the same craggy, used-up face, the same great red beard, his bald crown shining in the light from the naked bulb above his head. He had 3 companions, German soldiers. There was a crate of beer on the floor, and they were playing whist, if I knew my Ezra. I stood up and moved away. A moment later there was a roar of laughter. A chair scraped, and someone opened the door. It was one of the Germans. I moved into the shadows and found myself against the rear wall of the boathouse. There was a door at my back. When I tested the latch, it opened at my touch, and I moved quietly into the darkness and closed it again. The cottage door closed, cutting off the voices. I waited for a moment, and then took out my torch. And I couldn't believe what I saw when I flashed it briefly. In the darkness I moved closer and ran my hand along her counter, and she spoke to me, every lovely familiar inch of her. For a moment the years slipped away, and I could see the great 20-foot curtains of green water rolling in to crush us, felt myself go, and fell into the rear cockpit to fetch up against the legs of the man at the wheel. Ezra Scully, coxswain of the Saint-Pierre lifeboat, one of the greatest names in the history of the lifeboat service. I ran a hand across my eyes and found myself again in the quiet darkness, alone with a 41-foot Watson-type motor lifeboat named Owen Morgan. Not all lifeboatmen are fishermen. In Northumberland, you'll find miners in the crews, in Wales, farmers. It would be dangerous for me to claim that my father was the only artist to serve as a second coxswain, but it seems likely. The boat which killed him was named the Cecily Jackson and was a 35-footer. I was 14 when it happened, in the spring of 1932. The Viking, or Norwegian coaster, had gone aground on the Pinnacles in the early hours, and the Cecily Jackson had been launched just before dawn. The Viking was grinding herself to death on the most dangerous reef in the Channel Islands, in near hurricane conditions, and only a miracle worker could hope to get close enough to give the 18 men on board a chance to jump. But the Viking had her genius, Ezra Scully. And he took the boat in with a rush, no more than a foot in it for 5 vital seconds, playing his engines to hold him there, nailed into place as 2 jumped for their lives. Again he repeated the performance, and yet again. And at last there was only one man left, one terrified human being clinging halfway down the ladder. On the last run-in my father reached for him, and the poor wretch would not let go. Neither would my father, for he was that kind of man. And as the Cecily Jackson sheered off, he went over, still hanging on to the sailor, and they both went into the sea. Already the tide was running, the dreaded coursier, the mill race of Saint-Pierre. It caught the lifeboat, sending her back against the Viking, once, twice, 3 times, crushing the life out of Owen Morgan. The Cecily Jackson made it into harbour, and then a tremendous wave roared in from the channel, turned her over, and splintered her against the granite walls of the old Admiralty breakwater. 8 more had died that cold morning, but the rest, including Ezra Scully, had been saved, dragged from the surf and boiling waters by the human chain that snaked across the rocks. So my father died, and my mother with him, although she walked the earth for another 7 years. Funds were raised by public subscription to build a boathouse and concrete slipway at the bottom of the hill at Granville, and a new lifeboat to go with it, a 41-foot Watson type named the Owen Morgan. It was the click of the latch that brought me back to reality. The door was opening. There was no time to run, but as it closed and the light was switched on, I had the Mauser ready in my right hand. Ezra stared at me stupidly, half drunk, a crate of empty beer bottles swinging from one hand. I took off the steel helmet. "Hello, Ezra," I said softly.
"Owen," he said. "Is that you, lad?"
"As ever was, Ezra." He came close, reached up and touched my face gently.
"By God, lad, what have they done to you?"
"The war, Ezra, the war." He nodded slowly, gripping me in a brief bear hug, and then pushed me away. "Where's Simone?" I asked.
"Lives in the cottage at La Falaise now on her own. The Jerrys use the seigneury as a field hospital. Old Riley runs it for them."
The final nail into Joe Saint-Martin's coffin. "Now listen carefully, Ezra," I said. "I haven't got much time. What do you know about the blackjack installation?"
"So that's why you're here. How did you know about that?"
I told him.
"You're wasting your time, Owen. Nothing for you here. The whole blackjack project's flat on its face. Lack of torpedoes, see? On top of that, most of the lads concerned have been killed. Brittany U-boat bases that are still in German hands are heavily blockaded, difficult for supply boats to get through."
"You seem remarkably well informed."
"Oh, we listen to the BBC News every night," he said. "One of the sergeants billeted on me as a radio." He hesitated. "No trouble there, Owen, for my sake. They're good lads, all of them."
"Fair enough," I said, "as long as we don't meet head-on."
"What happens now?" he asked.
"I'd like to see Simone if I can, then I'll be leaving. Not for long now, though. On its last legs, this war." I tapped the hull of the Owen Morgan. Got the shock of my life when I found this old beauty in here. "Don't tell me she's still in use." He chuckled.
"Well, she ain't been out of the shed since July 1940 when Jerry came, but she's an apple pie trim, engines sweet as a nut. I check her every week, see? If it were daylight, you'd see where a stray bomb landed on the slipway during the original invasion. Never been able to get her out. The beach is mined, even if she could be hauled down there, so they've let her be."
The cottage door opened. A door banged.
"Ezra, what's keeping you? Where's that beer?" "Better go."
He pulled a crate from beneath an old workbench. He switched off the light and left, banging the door behind him, leaving me alone in the darkness. I retrieved the bicycle and went back the way I had come. La Falaise was the name of a small valley a quarter of a mile from the cliffs at the southwest corner of the island and not very far from my landing point. The way down to it had never been more than a sunken cart track, and it was still so. The cottage was rather more substantial than the name implied. I remembered it most for the magnificent views it gave over the sea towards the Brittany coast. I pushed the bike behind the nearest hedge, stripped off the overcoat and helmet, covered them with brushwood, and went forward cautiously. I came to the entrance to the courtyard at the rear of the cottage and paused. A vehicle was parked there. I moved closer and found that it was a VW field car. I moved round to the front of the cottage. Light showed faintly at the bottom of the curtain of the first window, but I could not see inside. I moved past the front porch and tried the next window. It was something of a shock to find him so close to me. Steiner, I mean, for it had to be him. He sat on the other side of the room at an easel and painted with watercolours, my father's favourite medium. He was in his shirt-sleeves, uniform trousers, and boots. He had dark, curling hair that was prematurely white at the temples and a strong, bony face that was full of character. Soldier, scholar, he could have been either. Circumstances would decide with a man like that. Had decided. I couldn't see what he was painting, couldn't see anything to the left of me where he occasionally glanced, so I moved to the window at the other end of the cottage. My hands tightened on the window ledge. Simone de Beaumarchais posed at the far end of the room, a length of blue silk around her waist, a touch of arrogance in the way she stood there, breasts naked, one hand on hip. It seemed that she was looking towards me, but of course it was Steiner she looked at. Steiner, for whom she smiled, so that the heart turned over in me. Had she ever smiled at me like that? Had she ever? And suddenly I could taste salt on my lips, taste salt on her flesh, feel my back warm in the sun. In 1935, on the day following Simone's 19th birthday, a day of high summer, we took to sea in a new 10-foot sailing dinghy, a present from her father.
It was a day of heat and cloudless sky, and the island was a painted backcloth. I should have been warned, but she was like a child with a new toy and wanted to sail to the pinnacles. And for me, she could do no wrong, not then or ever. 3 miles out, we turned over. There was no hope of righting the dinghy. I finally got Simon up across the keel and hung on beside her. We were both wearing life jackets. And then fog rolled in, and perhaps half an hour later the dinghy decided to go down like a stone. The tide was beginning to turn now, le coursier, the mill race, rippling the water all around us, running like a river in spate, a 10-knot current carrying us along in its implacable grip. And it was the mill race that saved us. That was the strange thing. That and the life jackets. We were 3 miles from Charlottetown, close to the pinnacles, and the current skirted the northern coast and turned, brushing against the southeast corner of Saint-Pierre, before moving on towards Brittany. I unbuckled my belt and lashed us together, and for an hour and a half we floated, carried relentlessly through the curtain of grey, and then, with startling suddenness, there was the thunder of surf, white water crashing in across great black rocks. Then the waves took us in together in a great crashing maelstrom of water, and deposited us on the sloping sands of La Grande Bay. I remember getting an arm round her and staggering forward as another wave crashed in, and then we were safe, and she was lying on her face, coughing up water. What happened next was, I suppose, rather obvious and completely natural. I can remember her kissing me, her hand behind my head, the salt taste of her lips, of her skin, the sun warm on my back. She pulled on an old dressing gown. Steiner was buttoning his tunic. They moved towards the door. I stood in the shadows and watched. The door opened. There was a light, gay laugh. "Tomorrow, nice and early. We'll go for a ride, all right?" His English was perfect. "Tomorrow, then. I look forward to it." He leaned down to kiss her. She walked a couple of yards with him, and he kissed her again and went round to the courtyard. I slipped into the cottage behind her back. The kitchen door stood ajar, and I moved inside quickly and waited. The engine of the VW roared into life. The sound moved away along the track, faded into the night. I heard footsteps, the click of the latch. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. She stood at the fireplace, combing her hair, in the mirror above the mantel, and she saw me at once. "Owen?" she said. "Owen?" She had recognized me instantly, black patch, scarred face, 5 years of hard usage and all. She fed me in the kitchen. There was bread of a sort, flour being in very short supply, home-cured bacon, and beer to wash it down. I drank a little and grinned. So Ezra's still brewing in his spare time. You recognize it? Once tasted, never forgotten. She was sitting on the other side of the scrubbed kitchen table and reached across, covering my right hand with her own. "So long, Owen. So very long." "For me, too." I raised her hand to my mouth, kissed it gently, and held it for a moment against my cheek. There were tears in her eyes. "Oh, Owen, your poor face." We got up and went back into the living room, and she put another log on the fire. I got out my cigarettes and gave her one. She inhaled deeply and sighed. I'd forgotten what a player's tasted like. I lit one myself. "How bad has it been?" She shrugged. "The past year hasn't been too good. Food shortages and so on. We haven't had a supply boat in for a month." "And how have you been treated?" "On the whole, very fairly. I'm useful, you see. Remember my 3 years at medical school? I help Paddy in the hospital. They really need us." There were 3 of my father's watercolours on the wall, things he had given to the old seigneur over the years. Steiner's easel had been moved to the far end of the room, and I went towards it. Strange how neither of us had mentioned him, even obliquely, during the past half-hour. The painting was almost finished, and was so good that it took my breath away. It wasn't just the technique, but the style, the sureness of touch, the feeling for form and beauty. I said quietly, "My father once told me that any fool could use oils, but that it took a painter to produce a watercolour. This man's as good as he ever was. That would be the greatest compliment you could pay him." "Do you love him?" She stared at me, eyes dark holes in the white face, and I walked to the bedroom door, opened it, and switched on the light. There was enough to tell me what I wanted to know. A couple of military hairbrushes on the dressing-table in silver, with the Brandenburg Division's crest engraved on the back, a razor, shaving brush, and soap by the wash-basin. I turned. "Do you love him?" I said tonelessly. In the distance there was a burst of small arms fire. I went outside. There was more firing from the general direction of Charlottetown and the sinister rattle of a machine gun. A moment later, heavy diesel engines rumbled into life. Simone appeared beside me, and I said quickly, "What's in the harbour at the moment?" "Hardly anything," she said. "Mainly fishing boats left by the islanders. Oh, I'm forgetting the E-boat that came in yesterday. Just a moment, I've got some glasses in the cottage somewhere." An E-boat. Of all the luck! I could hear the engines very clearly now. There was more firing, and then Simone appeared with a pair of binoculars in a leather case. They were Zeiss, the very best night glasses obtainable, and I didn't bother asking her where they had come from. I could see the curve of the Admiralty breakwater and the entrance to the new harbour. I focused in time to see the E-boat move out to sea, and Simone tugged at my sleeve. "What is it, Owen? What does it mean?" "It means everything's gone to hell," I told her. It was very much later that I was able to piece together a picture of what happened that night. Fitzgerald most definitely acted contrary to orders. The trouble was that he and his men had found little to occupy them in the new harbour apart from planting mines on fishing boats. The strange thing is that they didn't penetrate as far as Old Harbour, where they would have found the E-boat tied up to the jetty for the night, a target that would have certainly made their trip worthwhile. Moving inshore, Fitzgerald had happened to notice a guard on an old warehouse, and had decided this might well have something to do with the Blackjack project. He and Grant had landed and approached the building to reconnoitre, and had been immediately scented by 2 Alsatian guard dogs. The sentry had opened fire, and the whole thing had escalated from there. The E-boat commander had acted without hesitation. It must have been apparent to him the moment the dreaded cry of "Commandos" was raised, that the raiders must have been offloaded in the vicinity, and he would have been well aware the type of boat used by the Navy for this kind of operation. I raked the darkness out there beyond the breakwater, thinking of Dobson and his crew, and the unpleasant fact that the E-boat would have 10 or 15 knots on them. And then, out there on the edge of night, a tracer flashed through the darkness in a great arc, a star shell burst, and all hell broke loose. The MGB jumped into view. I could see everything perfectly in the flash of the guns, right down to figures on the bridge, and then a shell landed aft, and there was a terrific explosion, and she started to burn. I swung the glasses and caught the E-boat turning in a circle, hammering her adversary with everything she had. The MGB was in a hell of a state, flames rising into the night from her stern, but she still had a fair turn of speed, and it was this that her commander used in the end. The E-boat turned in again, closing for the kill, but this time her commander cut it just a little too close. The MGB turned into her so fast that she heeled right over. A moment later the 2 boats collided. There was an enormous crash, and then an explosion that rent the night, a great mushroom of fire and smoke climbing into the darkness as the fuel tanks started to go. I could see men leaping into a sea that had become a lake of fire, and lowered the glasses. Simone was crying, her face turned into my shoulder. I put an arm round her and gently led her inside. I almost missed the vehicle approaching. From the sound of it, it was the VW field car, which meant Steiner, and that made a certain amount of sense. He was already on his way to the porch, boots crunching in the gravel. She started for the door, glancing desperately at me over her shoulder, and I gave her a reassuring wave and went out through the kitchen. I waited in the quiet darkness, and she opened the front door and greeted him. "What was it, Manfred?" Commandos penetrated the harbour. I think you should come into Charlottetown for the night. Surely that's not necessary. She managed a light laugh. They'd hardly be likely to harm me. There was a slight pause, and he said in a puzzled voice, "What's this?" I realized that I was not wearing my cap, and I peered through the crack of the door and saw him standing near the fireplace holding it in his hands. He was dressed as he had been before, except that he now had a Luger pistol in a leather holster at his waist. "Who has been here, Simon? You must tell me." I moved to the door, the Mauser in my left hand. "The Gestapo invented these for quiet killing, and they really work, so do exactly as you're told. Get his gun, Simon." He stood there, carved from stone, staring down at her as she moved nearer to him. She closed her eyes, shuddered, and stepped back. "No, Owen. I won't take sides." It knocked me completely off balance. I glanced towards her. Steiner tossed the cap into my face. In the same moment, he had my left wrist, twisted the Mauser from my grasp, dropped to one knee, and threw me so that I somersaulted across the room. I came up on my feet, the knife already in my right hand, and brought my arm back for the throw. His reflexes were fantastic. The Luger was in his hand. We both stared death in the face in that brief moment. Then Simone drove in between us, clutching my Mauser in one hand. "Stop it!" she screamed. "Stop this stupid, senseless killing!" I crouched, waiting. Steiner stayed on one knee, Luger ready. "This is Owen Morgan, Manfred," she cried. "Don't you understand? This is Owen Morgan." He smiled suddenly, stood up, and pushed the Luger back into its holster. Then he put an arm around her. "It's all right, Simon. Everything will be all right now." He tried to take the Mauser from her hand, and she backed away from him. "No, I'm keeping this for the moment. I hold the balance, is that understood? I won't have either of you hurt. I won't stand for it." She stared at us wildly, turned and rushed into the bedroom. The door banged, and Steiner shook his head and sighed. Poor Simon. War is difficult enough at the best of times, but then, when you don't want to take sides... He held out a hand. "Manfred Steiner. I've wanted to meet you for quite a while now. The famous Owen Morgan." I didn't realize I was quite that. "From Simon, it is Owen Morgan, from morning to night." I gave him a cigarette, and he eyed me speculatively. "You came with the commandos?" "I was in command of the overall operation." "But not in uniform?" I shrugged. "In uniform or out, what does it matter where the Kommando Befehl holds?" "And it holds here, I warn you," he said. "The acting governor, Colonel Radl, is a hard man, the kind who believes in obeying orders, however unpleasant, and standing orders still lay down that special service troops of any description, when captured, are to be executed as soon as possible, and that the commander in each area will be held personally responsible to see that this order is obeyed to the letter." "How many of the raiding party survived?" "I don't know. There are certainly prisoners, 2 at least." He shook his head. "What point was there to it?" "We were after you, as a matter of fact, and your blackjack installation." The blackjack installation?" He burst into a roar of laughter. There is no blackjack installation. Hasn't been for something like 2 months now, which is when we used our last torpedoes." He laughed again and shook his head. "For us the war is over, or it was until this little affair tonight." "Which still leaves us with Colonel Radl and his SS paratroopers, and the situation here." Simon stood in the bedroom doorway. "What happens if he lays hands on Owen?" "Rather awkward now that you can't be picked up," Steiner said. "Have you anything else in mind?" I left an inflatable dinghy back there where I landed. I could try for France.
A long shot?
Better than staying here. Am I to presume that you won't interfere?" He nodded towards Simon.
"As far as I'm concerned, you haven't even been here. Have you any idea how the SS would treat her if they suspected you'd had any contact?"
"I certainly have," I said. I checked my watch. The exit hole at the bottom of the Devil's Staircase would still be under 4 or 5 feet of water, but the level would drop rapidly within the next hour or so. There was really very little point in continuing here. I picked up my cap, pulled it on, and moved to the easel. "I like your work." Simone came forward and thrust my Mauser into my hand. She burst into tears and flung herself down on the couch. Steiner held out his hand. "Goodbye, Owen Morgan. I would like to have known you better, but the war, as always, has a habit of getting into the way of things." It took me no more than half an hour to work my way across to the road that led down to the bunker above the Devil's Staircase. I heard voices when I was still 100 yards or more away from it, and a half-track troop carrier roared out of the night. There was all kinds of activity down there around the bunker, and after a while another vehicle arrived, and I heard dogs snarling angrily. That did it. I moved out fast and set off across the fields in the general direction of Granville. I needed a place no one would ever suspect, and remembered the cliffs above Horseshoe Bay where I had played as a boy with Simon, a secret hiding place halfway down at a seemingly inaccessible spot. I had some difficulty finding it in the dark, but finally made it in one piece, scratched and bruised, and squatted under an overhang of rock on a small ledge surrounded by gorse bushes. If I could hide throughout the daylight hours, there was just a chance, just one slim chance, that they might think they had accounted for everyone and would call off the search. I crouched there and waited as light gradually seeped into the darkness on the edge of the world. Down there in the bay, the bodies started to come in with the tide just after dawn, bobbing in through the surf to the beach 100 feet below my hiding place, some German, some British. They were all that was left of the MGB and the E-boat. From where I crouched, it was impossible to distinguish us from them. The bay was called Horseshoe for obvious reasons. As a boy, I had swum down there on more occasions than I could remember, and there was an excellent beach when the tide was out. An inhospitable shore now, though, seeded with mines and choked by barbed wire strung between rusting steel lances. It was raining slightly, and visibility was not good in the dawn mist, so that even Fort Victoria on its rocky point 1/4 of a mile away was barely visible. A wave slopped in, flinging a body high in the air, casting it farther up the beach than the others. As it landed, a mine exploded, tossing it up again, arms flailing wildly as if there was still life there. What was left was flung across the wire to hang like raw meat. 10 minutes later the next one floated in, supported by a yellow life jacket. The sea retreated, leaving the body face down. It seemed to move slightly. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but I was wrong, for as the curtain of green foam slopped in again, an arm was raised to claw at air, and I seemed to hear a faint cry as the man was pushed towards the wire. I crouched in the shelter of the gorse bushes, waiting for something to happen. It came from an unexpected quarter, the fold in the cliffs on my right, from which a narrow track dropped to the beach. I heard voices. Then 6 men appeared and paused on the brow of the hill about 50 feet above the sea. They were tote workers, a few of the poor wretches brought over from France to labour on the island's fortifications. This lot was a road gang from the looks of them, and carried picks and shovels. One of them moved ahead and started to slide down the slope to the beach below. He dropped the last 10 or 15 feet into soft sand, picked himself up, and approached the wire. Another great wave rolled in, washing a second body into the minefield. There was a sudden eruption, and for a moment the sea boiled. When it drew back, I was surprised to see that the man in the yellow life jacket was still alive. The tote worker, who had thrown himself flat on his face, got up and paused uncertainly. He knew about the mines now. I took the Mauser with the SS bulbous silencer from the clip at the rear of my belt and slipped it into the pocket of my reefer coat. Then I took the coat off and pushed it into the crevasse at the back of the overhang under which I was sheltering. I transferred my knife to my right-hand pocket. What else was there? Ah, yes, my identity discs. I checked that they were safe in the secret pocket of my belt. And the black patch which covered what was left of my right eye. I pulled it down around my neck on its elasticated band. I went down a narrow crevasse for 20 or 30 feet and emerged onto a shoulder of rock. The tote workers on the hillside saw me at once, but the man on the beach was back at the wire, looking for a way through. "No good! Too many mines!" I shouted in French. "Leave it to me!" He turned and looked up in surprise, so I gave it to him in English and German for good measure. Some little way below, a rock jutted out 30 feet or so above deep water. When I was 12, I had jumped from it to impress Simon. I took a quick breath and jumped. It was cold. I went deep and kicked with all my strength as the current caught me. I was wearing canvas rope-soled shoes, denim pants, and a Guernsey fisherman's sweater, and all these things I had retained by design. I surfaced and started to swim the 100 yards that separated me from Horseshoe. The swimming in itself was no great feat. All I had to do was stay afloat, and the tidal current did the rest. A great wave took me in its iron grip and carried me in at speed. I touched sand and found myself high on the beach as the sea drained away. The man in the yellow life jacket was no more than 10 yards to my left. He was perhaps 17, a young German naval rating, a telegraphist according to the badge on his sleeve. His left shoulder and arm were a bloody mess. He was obviously in deep shock. I got an arm around him as another wave washed over us. When I shook the salt water from my eyes and looked across the wire, the tote workers were moving down the path in company with 3 German soldiers, 2 of whom carried machine pistols. And then a horse whinnied, and I looked up and saw Steiner sitting on a grey mare on the brow of the hill. He called to the men below, telling them to stay where they were. He dismounted and went down the path to join them. There was a quick conversation, and then one of the soldiers scrambled back up the path to where the mare grazed peacefully and disappeared over the brow of the hill on her back. The other 2 herded the tote workers back, and Steiner came down on his own carrying 3 stick grenades in his left hand. He wore a 3/4-length coat with a black fur collar, which I happen to know was standard issue to Russian officers of staff rank only, and his Brandenburger forage cap was tilted at the exact regulation angle. He stopped on the other side of the wire. "I'd expected you long gone by now, Owen Morgan." "The best laid schemes and all that," I said. "Does it matter?" "Not really. What have you got there?" "One of yours, a telegraphist from the E-boat." "Will he live?" "I should imagine so." "Good. Stay exactly where you are." He moved 20 or 30 yards away along the beach. I saw him toss the first grenade over the wire. There was a double explosion, followed by a third, as mines started to detonate each other. I lost sight of him through a curtain of smoke and sand. As it cleared, he tossed the second grenade. The waves washed in again, stronger than ever. As I came up for air, the third grenade landed. There were 4 quite distinct explosions. Birds called, wheeling high above, rising from the cliff face. Steiner was standing at one end of the ragged path he had blasted through the wire to the water's edge. I called out, "Careful! No guarantee you got them all." "Only one way of finding out." He walked through as calmly as if he were taking a Sunday afternoon stroll in the park. There was a sudden roar of an engine as a VW field car appeared and braked on the brow of the hill. Several soldiers got out and started down towards the beach. Steiner said, "I'm sorry about this, but there's little I can do now. You understand that?"
"Naturally."
"Have you any weapons?"
"My knife only."
"Give it to me."
He slipped it into his pocket and got a hand under the young sailor's arm.
"Let's get him out of here before he dies on us. This business might help you considerably."
I said, "You look after Simon, that's all I ask. Don't waste your time on me. I'm a dead man walking, and we both know that." We ploughed through the surf, the boy between us, and stumbled through the gap. The men who waited on the other side were military police. There were 4 of them, 3 corporals and a major. 2 of them took the boy from us, laid him down carefully on a stretcher, and gave him some quick first aid. Steiner had walked a yard or 2 away, brushing sand from his coat. The major came forward and looked me over. "Who are you?" he demanded in bad French. Steiner answered for me.
"Major Brandt," he said, "this gentleman is a British officer who has just sacrificed his freedom to save the life of a German sailor."
Brandt hesitated fractionally and then turned to me and said in quite reasonable English, "You will please identify yourself." "My name is Morgan. My service number is 2103-8930. My rank is Lieutenant Colonel." He clicked his heels and produced a silver cigarette case. "May I offer you a cigarette, Colonel?" I took it and drew the smoke into my lungs with conscious pleasure. "And now," he said politely, "I must ask you to accompany me to the Platzkommandantur in Charlottetown, where Colonel Radl, the acting governor of St. Pierre, will no doubt wish to speak to you." The field car dropped us in the square and departed with the injured sailor, and we walked the rest of the way, climbing the steep cobbles of Charlotte Street, past shops that stood empty now. Windows were broken everywhere, paint peeling, and there was a general air of decay, not surprising after 5 years of occupation. The Platzkommandantur, headquarters of the German civilian administration, was housed in what had been the island branch of the Westminster Bank. 3 uniformed clerks worked industriously on the other side of the mahogany counter, and the 2 sentries on either side of the door to what had once been the manager's office were SS paratroopers. Brandt went in first, and we waited. Steiner made no attempt to speak, and stood at the window looking out into the street. Within a couple of minutes Brandt called for him, and he went in. Then Brandt reappeared. "Please to come in, Colonel Morgan," he said in English, and as I went forward he called the 2 guards to attention. I think it was Radl's physical presence that was the most astonishing thing about him. He must have been 6'3" or 4" at least, and couldn't have weighed less than 16 or 17 stone. And his face, with the great jutting brow and deep-set eyes, was the face of some fanatical Roundhead. He stayed in his seat, both hands on the desk. "Your name? Rank? Number?" His English was poor, and I replied in German. He showed not the slightest surprise, and continued in the same language. "You can prove this?" I fiddled about on the inside of my belt and produced my identity discs. I passed them across and waited as he examined them gravely. "Owen Morgan. Now that I find interesting. Did you know that the lifeboat on this island bears that name?" "After my father. I was born and raised here." "So," he nodded. "That explains a great deal. You were here to find out what you could about the Black Jack project." "Was I?" "You wasted your time. Your men made a mess of the business in the harbour, and your gunboat is at the bottom of the sea. Mission a failure." He looked me straight in the face. "You are familiar with the Kommando Befehl?" "Naturally." "Then you will know that under its provisions all members of so-called commando units must be executed as soon after capture as may be." "You're certainly taking your time about it." "The new governor, Korvettenkapitän Karl Olbricht, has not yet arrived." "Oh, so you're just filling in." "Something like that." "And I can expect to be shot only when the real governor flies in to sign the paper." "What happens in the meantime?" "You work, Colonel Morgan. There is plenty of work for you here. You work in chains with the rest of your companions." We drove up to Fort Edward on the point above Charlottetown. It was the largest of the 4 Victorian naval forts. There was a sentry at the gate beside a machine gun in a sand-bagged emplacement, and he waved us through the granite archway with Victoria Regina and the date 1856 carved above it.
Inside, we got out of the field car, and Brant waved me on towards the wooden doors of the old blockhouse, which stood open. One of his police corporals hurried ahead. When we went inside, he had the leg irons ready. Brant turned and said in English, "I'm sorry, Colonel." The corporal dropped to his knees and quickly snapped the steel collars around my ankles and tightened them with a screw key. The chain between them was little over 2 feet in length. Brant led the way without a word. We mounted the stone steps at the side of the blockhouse to the lower ramparts. We mounted to the second terrace and surprised a 16-year-old who lounged beside an ammunition store, his rifle against the wall. He jumped to attention. Brant sighed, unbolted the door, and stood to one side. "Colonel," he said. I moved in. The doors closed behind me. There was plenty of light in there from the old gun ports. They were waiting to greet me. Fitzgerald, Grant, Sergeant Hagan, and Corporal Wallace. "Christ Jesus, it's the Colonel," Hagan said. Fitzgerald didn't seem to be able to think of anything to add. I smiled amiably at him. "What was it your orders said?" "You will not, repeat not, attempt to land or provoke any incidents of a kind liable to alert the enemy to your presence. Enjoy yourself, did you?" Grant took a quick step towards me, those great hands of his clenched, forgot his leg irons, and fell on his knees. "Now then, Sergeant, now then," I chided him. "That's the trouble with you Rangers. No respect for rank." Later that morning, the door of the old ammunition store was unlocked, and a couple of SS paratroopers appeared. They ordered us out. A half-track troop carrier was waiting in the courtyard, and we were driven to the harbour. There seemed to be about 30 or 40 German troops, and the same number of tote workers shivering in their ragged clothes. There were about 20 fishing boats of various sizes and types, anchored in the lee of the breakwater. I saw Steiner on the lower jetty as I got out of the troop carrier. He was wearing a frogman's suit of black rubber, and there were 4 other men with him in the same rig. They were all Brandenburgers, all that survived of the original group which had manned the Blackjack installation. They had 2 of the Rob Roy canoes on the jetty, obviously salvaged from the harbour, for Fitzgerald and his men had followed the usual procedure of sinking them, together with all their equipment, when faced with capture. Half a dozen limpet mines were laid out in a neat line, and the Brandenburgers were apparently defusing them there and then. They had the manner of all special service troops everywhere. I got to know them all well in the time that followed that first day. Lanz and Obermeier, the 2 sergeants, Corporal Hildorf, who had been a schoolteacher, and Schreiber, who had worked in a bank in Vienna. Lanz crouched, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he delicately removed a fuse from one of the mines. Obermeier made a remark I couldn't quite catch, but there was a burst of laughter. Everyone else was standing well back for obvious reasons, and I noticed Major Brandt watching at the edge of the crowd. He turned casually, saw us, and came forward. He saluted formally. "Good morning, Colonel." "What are we here for?" I asked. "Colonel Radl's orders. He will be here himself soon." I produced my tin of cigarettes. There were only 8 left now. I lit one, flicked the match away, and walked across to the steps leading down to the lower jetty, my chain clinking musically. There was a harsh metallic click as a machine pistol was cocked by one of the SS paratroopers, and Brandt said crisply in German, "No, let him go." I was halfway down when Fitzgerald appeared above me. I waited at the bottom, and when he reached me, he said calmly, "Join you if I may, sir. I told the others to stay where they are." I looked up as Grant and Hagan appeared at the top of the steps. "I always did say you Yanks had no discipline." He smiled at that with something like warmth for the first time since I'd known him. Steiner waited for us, hands on hips, his men grouped behind him except for Lanz, who crouched where he was, a mine between his feet. "Morning," I called in German as we approached. "Having fun?" Steiner grinned. "Depends on your point of view," he called back. "A new model. Lanz is finding the fuse box cover tricky." Grant arrived at that precise moment with the other 3 Rangers, and we all stood watching. It was Sergeant Hagan who started it off. "What's he trying to do, for Christ's sake? Blow us all up or something?" He squatted beside Lanz and put a hand on his arm. "Not that way, buddy. Let me." He turned gently and lifted. "It's all in feeling for the coil spring at just the right point. I guess you were lucky with the first one." The cover came out, and as he held it, Lanz gently withdrew the fuse. The German grinned and slapped the American on the shoulder. There was a sudden stir above. We turned and saw Radl at the top of the steps. He stood looking down at us all for a moment, and then descended the steps slowly. Brunt followed him. As they joined us, Hagen removed the last fuse, and the whole group, Germans and Americans alike, gave a ragged cheer. Radl turned to me. "I made a grave error last night, Colonel Morgan, in assuming that the sole purpose of the raid was to attack targets on land. You will tell me now, please, which boats in the harbour have been mined." Fitzgerald took a step forward. "You're talking to the wrong man, Colonel. I was in charge of the harbour operation." "Then you will give me the information I require." "Well now, Colonel," Fitzgerald said, "I don't really see my way clear to doing that." "Very well. You leave me no choice." He turned to Brandt. "By my reckoning, there are 23 boats in the harbour. Round up as many tote workers as you can find in the vicinity. We will have 2 or 3 on each boat." As far as Fitzgerald was concerned, it took a moment or two for it to sink in, but when it did, his face turned pale. "Does he mean what I think he means?" he demanded, a hand on my arm. "I would imagine so." He suddenly looked rather tired. "Okay, Colonel, you win. We attached mines to 5 of the boats out there. They were timed for 10 o'clock, which doesn't give us more than half an hour, so we'd better get moving." They used the 2 Rob Roy canoes with a Brandenburger and a Ranger in each to retrieve the mines, and Radl stood at the edge of the jetty and watched. "Today's comforting thought," I said to Steiner. "If anything blows, we all go together, including him." "We have a saying," he said. "Some good in every misfortune." "How long before the new governor arrives?" I asked him. "Captain Olbricht? I'm not sure. He's quite the hero, you know. A big U-boat ace. He was badly wounded last year, which put an end to active sea duty for him. We're expecting an armed coaster to attempt the blockade from Saint-Denis with ammunition and supplies. An old tub called Pride of Hamburg. He's supposed to be coming with her." "She's not left yet?" He shook his head. "Something called the Royal Navy can prove rather awkward in these waters. The captain of the Pride of Hamburg is an old salt called Ritter. I know him well. He usually waits for dirty weather and uses it as cover." He left me and went to join Fitzgerald and the others as the first canoe returned with its mines. I watched for a moment, then turned and started to shuffle away. Brandt followed me up the steps, and the crowd of soldiers at the top moved back when he sharply ordered them to. "Owen Morgan, is that you?" Paddy Riley, the island doctor, pushed his way through the press. He must have been at least 70, a tall, white-haired Irishman, with an untidy beard who had never lost his accent. He pumped my hand up and down, smiling hugely, yet there was something in his eyes, something that told me he knew more than he was able to say. I turned and I noticed Ezra watching me. There was a German with him in a uniform with a distinct nautical flavour to it. "Ezra!" I called. "Ezra Scully, you old devil! How are you? It must be all of 5 years." He played up well and came and shook hands. "I heard you were with this party, Owen," he said. "Sergeant Major Steiner told me." I nodded. "I didn't think you'd still be here." "Oh, they need a harbour pilot, see? This here is Captain Varga, Wilhelm Varga, the harbour master, though there's precious little for him to do these days. He's not a bad fellow." I nodded to Varga, who insisted on shaking hands. "A pleasure, Colonel Morgan," he said in his precise, stiff English. The first day of spring is a morning of blue skies and soft air and scents and sounds that all winter long one has forgotten existed. Working up there on the spine of the island, I was glad to be alive. I swung the 10-pound hammer high above my head and brought it down with all my force, splitting the stone in front of me, then rested for a moment, wiping sweat from my eyes with the back of a hand. There were 30 of us in all, the rest being tote workers and the half-dozen pioneers with their machine pistols. They were commanded by a sergeant called Brown, one of the 3 I had seen playing cards with Ezra at his cottage. It was mid-morning when Steiner arrived in a field car. He produced a slip of paper, which he showed to Brown, who nodded at once, and Steiner crossed to where I was working. "Colonel Morgan, you will come with me." I climbed into the passenger seat of the VW with difficulty because of my chains, and Steiner got behind the wheel and drove away. We took the road down towards the Devil's Staircase. "What's it all about?" I asked. "Simon wants to see you." "How did you manage it?" He took a paper from his pocket and passed it across. It stated that I was to be released into Sergeant Major Steiner's care for the purpose of assisting him with my local knowledge on a beach survey. It was signed by Captain Heinz Schellenberg of the 271st Pioneer Regiment. "Is it genuine?" I demanded. "Each day I examine beach defences, check upon what inroads the sea has made. Sometimes there is work that only frogmen can do. In such cases, any information you would be willing to give about local tide conditions would be invaluable. These are extraordinarily dangerous waters." He delivered all this with a perfectly straight face, and I said, "Schellenberg fell for that." "He used to work for my stepfather," Steiner said tranquilly, "along with half the population of Germany at a rough estimate. He would like to work for him again. I'm afraid that I allow him to think that I might have some influence in that direction." "The war ends any day now," I reminded him, "and your side lost. Where does that leave your father?" "Where it has always done, with several millions of dollars deposited in various Swiss banks with industrial interests throughout most of the world, including Great Britain and America, through subsidiary companies. The meek," he added with considerable irony, "shall inherit the earth." La Grande Bay from that day on became Steiner's Bay for me, and in all the years that have followed I found it impossible to think of it any differently. It lay at the bottom of 300-foot cliffs, a horseshoe of white sand slipping into blue-green water. It was reached by a narrow path fit only for goats that zigzagged across the face of the cliffs and was no place for the faint-hearted. We braked to a halt a foot or two away from a notice that warned of mines. "Where are we going?" I asked Steiner. "Get out and I'll show you." I pointed to the warning notice. "What about this?" Steiner smiled. "The engineer officer in charge of mine-laying back in 1940 fell in love with this beach to such an extent that he couldn't bear to mine it. He put up the notice and the barbed wire to make it look good." I swung my legs awkwardly to the ground, and he came around from the other side, produced a key, knelt down, and unlocked my irons. "Better to carry them," he said briefly. Halfway down I paused to watch her. She was wearing a black bathing costume, and her long dark hair was covered by a rubber bathing cap, so that, planing in through the surf, she might have been some legendary sea beast, half seal, half woman. "She's quite a girl, isn't she?" he said from behind. I turned and put it to him directly. "You love her, don't you?" "But of course. How could it be otherwise?" I dropped the last few feet into soft sand and moved across the beach as she came in on the next big one, head down, arms out in front of her. She got to her feet laughing and ran up the beach before the next one could catch her, tugging at her bathing cap. "Oh, Owen, it's good to see you again." Her towel was on a rock a few yards away, together with an old beach robe. She pulled it on and started to dry her legs. "So Manfred managed to pull it off." I turned, looking for Steiner, and found him gone. "Where is he?" "Getting his painting things from one of the caves. He keeps an easel down here permanently." "He paints a lot, then?" She nodded. "Particularly down here. He loves it." "Among other things." Her face darkened, and she looked not only uncertain but quite miserable. My heart went out to her, and I produced my waterproof tin of cigarettes, Old Faithful. I'd been taking it very steadily, and there were still 3 left. I held out the tin. She glanced inside and shook her head. "I'll share one with you." Which was a companionable thing to do. Steiner appeared from among the mass of great boulders that sprawled at the base of the cliff, carrying an easel and a wooden case. I watched him setting things up. Simone reached for my cigarette and inhaled. She handed it back, her face grave. "Is it very bad, Owen?" "The road gang?" I shook my head. "The guards are decent enough. They're cronies of Ezra." She smiled briefly. "Yes, I know." Then there was silence between us. I lay on my back and looked up at the cloudless sky. After a while she said hesitantly, It's all going to come out all right, Owen. Do you realize that?" "Is it?" "Of course it is," she said eagerly. "Manfred says Radl is a man who lives by the book. If it is in the regulations, he does it, but if it isn't—"
A comforting thought. She dropped to the sand beside me and said insistently,
"But it's true. Radl is only acting governor here. The war could be over any day now, according to the BBC. The Russians are fighting in the suburbs of Berlin. Albrecht will never get here now."
"I suppose Steiner told you that also?" Suddenly she struck at me blindly so that I had to catch her wrist to fend her off.
"Damn you, Owen Morgan," she raged, and for the first time became again the girl I had known before the war. "Damn you to hell! Why did you have to come back like this? Why couldn't you have waited?"
I was on my feet now and dragging her up with me. I shook her angrily. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" She stared up at me.
"All right, if you want the truth. I am in love with Manfred. I still love you, Owen. Now, what would you suggest that I do about that?"
She turned and ran, and kept on running, avoiding Steiner's outstretched hand until she reached the bottom of the path and started to climb. "What went wrong?" he demanded when I went over. "She's decided she's in love with two men at once." "And you believe that?" "She does. That's the important thing," I said sourly. He sat down at his easel and went back to work, and I lay in the sun, and we talked. I asked him why he hadn't tried for a commission. He shrugged. "All my life I have enjoyed all the advantages a man could possibly have. I decided to go to war without their help." For him, I reckon it was as simple as that. After a while, he seemed to stop talking, and I drifted into sleep. A gull cried high above my head, harsh, insistent, and I sat up with a start. Steiner was nowhere to be seen. For a moment I had the strange feeling that it might all be a dream. And then Steiner came out of the cave beyond the rocks, and I realized that he had been putting his equipment away. "So you are awake. Time to go now." I crossed to where the path began and started to scramble to the top. I reached the edge of the cliff in time to see a Mercedes staff car appear over the rise some 50 yards away and halt beside the field car. Steiner was still 20 or 30 feet below me. I ducked back out of sight and slid down to join him. I threaded the chain of my leg iron through my belt and I unbuckled it quickly. "Get these on me sharp," I ordered. "Radl has just arrived up top." We got the leg irons on between us in seconds. I'd barely started to climb when Radl appeared at the edge of the cliff. He had a couple of SS paratroopers with him and Schellenberg. He said to Steiner, "What is the meaning of this? I arrived to check the road gang's progress and find Colonel Morgan absent in your charge." Steiner said calmly, "That's right, sir. I did have the requisite chit, signed by Captain Schellenberg." Schellenberg was a thin-faced, middle-aged greying man who wore steel-rimmed spectacles. He looked worried. "Sergeant Major Steiner did assure me, sir, that he needed Colonel Morgan's local knowledge." "The trouble is, sir," Steiner said cheerfully, "that the exceptionally strong current in the bay when the mill race is running has virtually scoured the beach clear of mines over the years, but they must be down there somewhere." "Aiding the enemy, Colonel Morgan?" Radl said. "Strange conduct for a British officer." "On the contrary, I agreed to advise Steiner on this problem on humanitarian grounds. The war, in case you hadn't noticed, Colonel Radl, is about to fall flat on its face. Those mines will be everyone's problem soon." "Very commendable of you, Colonel Morgan." He nodded to Steiner. "If your task here is finished, you will return the colonel to the road gang." He got into the back of the Mercedes and was driven away. On the first day of May, a Tuesday as I remember, we were taken down to Granville and put to work below the lifeboat station. About 20 tote workers were already there when we arrived, and Steiner and his Brandenburgers came shortly afterwards. The area below the boathouse, including the slipway, had been bombed, as Ezra had told me that first night, and our task was to clear a level site for an extra blockhouse to be constructed. The Brandenburgers were at work on the other side of the barbed wire, laying mines. It was one of the tote workers who raised the alarm first, with a sudden cry, and I glanced up. Something seemed to be happening. There was a buzz of conversation, men running from one group to another, soldiers and workers together. There was actually laughter, a ragged cheer, and then Ezra appeared, running through the crowd. When he reached me, he seemed bereft of speech, and I grabbed his arm to steady him. "What is it, Ezra?"
What's gone wrong? Gone wrong? His head went back and his laughter lifted into the sky. God almighty, wrong, he says. When he looked at me again, his eyes were wet. The BBC have broadcast a special message, Owen. They say the Russians are into Berlin. They say Hitler's dead. Beyond him I saw Steiner staring across at me. Behind him, men were singing, weeping, laughing, embracing each other. Ezra grabbed my arms. It's true, Owen. The bloody war is over, don't you see? Brown and Schmidt, the two pioneer sergeants who were supposed to be in charge of us, had been in conference with Steiner. Obviously some plan of action had been agreed. Brown approached. "If you would be good enough to cool your men, Colonel," he told me politely. "We have decided to march everyone back to Charlottetown. You can wait in the church with the tote workers until we can discover exactly what is happening." The parish church of Saint-Pierre stood in a large cemetery behind high walls halfway up the main street by the Platz Kommandantur. When we arrived, no one seemed to know what to do, and I don't suppose the little church had seen such a crowd since high holy days before the war. The rain was falling so heavily now that everyone crowded in, soldiers as well as tote workers and prisoners, and Steiner and the pioneer sergeants got together again in a corner to discuss the situation. Finally, he left with Sergeant Schmidt, and Brown came over. "Sergeant Major Steiner has gone to see Colonel Radl." He shrugged helplessly. "To be frank with you, Colonel, no one really knows what to do." When Radl came in through the church door, 20 or so SS paratroopers fanned out behind him. There was complete silence as he walked slowly to the middle of the church and looked the tote workers over. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly mild. "You have been extremely foolish, all of you. You believed a lie, a stupid and senseless piece of propaganda put out by the enemy, a lie, because the announcement has no basis in fact. The Führer lives. There is no question of defeat. The German army still fights." His voice began to rise a little. "I've been in touch with our headquarters in Guernsey, and I can assure you that whatever happens in Europe, we will continue to fight in the Channel Islands. Do you hear me? We will continue the fight." His voice echoed in the rafters, and up there pigeons lifted in alarm. "There will be no breakdown of law and order on Saint-Pierre while I command. No slackening of discipline for anyone, and in that I include my own troops." Radl turned and nodded to one of the SS sergeants. "You may return the prisoners to their quarters in Fort Edward." We went out through the main door and lined up in the rain. The sergeant ordered us away, but as we started to march, Radl called from the porch, "A moment! Something I was forgetting." As he came out into the rain, he was smiling. "Good news, Colonel. A signal from Saint-Denis was handed to me as I was leaving my house. The Pride of Hamburg took advantage of the bad weather to leave harbour an hour ago." "With Albrecht on board?" I said. "Naturally. With luck, she should be here by noon tomorrow." He walked away through the rain, humming to himself cheerfully. He was a good soldier, Radl, I'll give him that. As we were marched off through the rain to Fort Edward, he returned to his headquarters and started to set his house in order. The small garrison was deployed around the island defences, and every bunker, every gun emplacement was fully manned and ready for action. This meant, of necessity, that in Charlottetown itself he could keep no more than 30 or 40 troops, but they were mainly SS paratroopers. I doubt if any of us got much sleep that night. The rain drummed against the roof ceaselessly, and from midnight on the wind started to moan. Up there on the battlements I could hear the sea pounding in across the rocks. I lay wrapped in a damp blanket and listened to it as it got worse. Spring storms could be bad in these waters, as bad as anything winter could provide. The Pride of Hamburg must be having a rough passage. Then, as Steiner had said, Ritter, her captain, preferred dirty weather. The Pride of Hamburg couldn't help but evade the Royal Navy on such a night. She would sail into Charlottetown harbour at noon and tie up at the north landing stage. Korvettenkapitän Karl Albrecht would be piped ashore, or whatever they did, and as his first task he would be presented with the problem of Owen Morgan and his happy band. But what if Albrecht didn't fancy the idea? What if he was the old-fashioned kind? What was the wording of paragraph 6 of the Kommando Befehl again? In the case of non-compliance with this order, I shall bring to trial before a court-martial any commander or other officer who has failed to carry out his duty or who has acted contrary to it. But the Kommando-Befehl had been a personal order from the Führer himself, who was now dead, according to the BBC. But if Albrecht decided against the executions, how would Radl react? Radl. Always one had to come back to Radl. At 6:30 the door opened, and young Durst, the boy soldier, came in with a pail of coffee, black bread, and cold sausages. I smiled at Durst. "How are things in the outside world?" "Bad, very bad." He shook his head. "They say the weather will continue to worsen." I climbed up to one of the old gun ports. The view, seaward, was fantastic. Leaden clouds belched heavy rain, dropping to meet waves that were now really beginning to lift. Through a sudden break in the curtain, I caught a glimpse of the pinnacles half a mile out, standing grimly above a welter of white water. The door opened, and the SS sergeant appeared and ordered us out. Fitzgerald sat on the bench, nursing a mug of coffee in both hands, staring into space. His face was grey and haggard, and I don't think I've ever seen such a change in a man. He got to his feet, reluctantly, and followed the rest of us out. Sergeant Lantz waited beside a truck in the courtyard, his black oilskins streaming moisture. When we reached the harbour, things, if anything, looked worse. There was a heavy swell inside the breakwater, and the wind was gusting to force 7 or 8, by my judgment. The harbour itself was in a hell of a state. The pioneers shepherded us and the tote workers along to the end of the jetty where the sea was coming hard through a great gap left by the naval bombardment of the previous year. There was plenty of rubble to hand from the ruins of some of those old houses which had been demolished in the bombardment. Several lines were formed, and stones and bricks were passed down from hand to hand until they reached the seat of the trouble and were thrown into the great hole in the sea wall. After an hour or so, more tote workers arrived, and we were pulled out of line to take a rest. A truck arrived, and hot coffee was dispensed from buckets to everyone. I found myself a corner that was at least protected from the wind, and it was there that Varga, the harbour-master, discovered me. He had an old yellow oilskin in his hand, and he held it out to me. "Please, Colonel, I could see you from my office. This is not good. It is barbaric." "For everyone here, not just me." I pulled on the oilskin and buttoned it. "My thanks." Glanced furtively around and produced a half-bottle of rum. "I should not tell you this, but they have had word from the Pride of Hamburg." I coughed as the rum burned its way down. "Trouble?" "Bad trouble." His face was grave. "She is 10 miles to the southwest and making heavy weather of it. Ritter says she has already sustained massive damage to her superstructure." "How's the wind now?" "Gale force, but twice my man has recorded gusts of 90 knots up there on the fort." "Could the Pride of Hamburg get into harbour in such conditions?" "She'll have to, won't she? There's nowhere else for her to go." The weather steadily deteriorated as the morning wore on, and we continued to work desperately in shifts to fill the breach. It was hopeless. I was resting again in the lee of my own particular wall when Varga returned. "You've heard from the Pride of Hamburg again, Colonel." "Bad news?" "Engine trouble of some kind," he told me hoarsely. "In his last message, Ritter said he was having difficulty in keeping her head into the sea. He has lost his lifeboats." "How far out?" "Couple of miles, but now they have lost radio contact." I think I knew then what was going to happen. What must happen, as so often in the past. It was a moment or so later that someone gave a cry and pointed, and when I looked out to sea, there was the Pride of Hamburg, a mile or so out. We all got the briefest of glimpses of her, and then she disappeared. The wind was getting stronger. I felt the physical impact of it, so that when it gusted, I had to put my head down and lean hard into it to keep my footing. Again the Pride of Hamburg lifted on the crest of a wave, then disappeared as suddenly. Disaster had its own smell, and there was not a man there who failed to sense it then. Ezra and Steiner came up from the lower jetty and joined Varga and myself. Strangely, it was to me that Ezra spoke, and to no one else. "Did you see her, Owen?" I nodded. "Varga says she's got trouble in the engine room. Hardly making any headway." "God help all aboard if that's true. Only one end out there in weather like this." "The pinnacles?" Steiner said. I nodded. A field car drove up, scattering the crowd, and Brunt jumped out and joined us. "Can't somebody do something?" he demanded. "What would you suggest?" I replied. "Isn't there a lifeboat?" "As a matter of fact, there is. Only there are one or two snags. In the first place, it's sitting in the boathouse at Granville, all ready for launching along a slipway that doesn't exist, onto a beach that's riddled with mines." For a while, the wind seemed to clear the rain out there on the edge of nowhere, and we saw the pinnacles half a mile out, jagged black teeth rearing from a welter of white water. I should say the Pride of Hamburg was no more than 300 yards away from the reef at that point, and drifting in fast. She fired a maroon and then another, though God knows what response she expected. A couple of moments later, she struck the rocks. We drove into Charlottetown in Brandt's field car, those of us who were most concerned with the affair, which meant Brandt, Steiner, Captain Schellenberg, Ezra, Fitzgerald, and myself. Radl was not at the Platz Kommandantur, but at his house, the old rectory on the other side of the church from the main street. Radl was apparently having an early lunch and was holding a napkin in one hand when he appeared from the dining room. He wasn't pleased. "And what, may I ask, is the meaning of this?" "With your permission, Colonel," Brandt said, "Colonel Morgan has an idea, a way of possibly helping those on the Pride of Hamburg." "Indeed?" Radl turned to me slowly. "Oh, it's really quite simple," I said. "There's a lifeboat at Granville, named the Owen Morgan," he cut in. "A landed whale, Colonel Morgan, no slipway, and if there was, a beach studded with mines. We drag her overland to Charlottetown," I said, "and launch her in the harbour." He raised the napkin to his mouth. "And for the crew?" I was a member of the crew here before the war, when Ezra Scully was coxswain. Sergeant Major Steiner and his men have all volunteered. "And so have mine, sir," Fitzgerald put in. Radl seemed to lose his temper completely. "Who the devil do you think you are, Morgan?" It was the first time he had failed to give me my rank. "I am in command here, and I say no to your crazy scheme, you understand?" He glared ferociously at each of us in turn. "Now get out of here!" Steiner said quietly, "Now I don't really think that we can, Colonel Radl." He produced a Luger from one of his oilskin pockets. All of us were taken by surprise, and certainly no such action had been mooted when I put my plan to them down at the harbour, for the good and sufficient reason that no one had really considered the possibility that Radl might refuse. "You see, we don't have time to argue any longer, Colonel Radl," Steiner said. "I'm afraid that I must insist that you see our point of view." "So, at last we have it, Steiner." Radl was actually smiling, if smile you could call it. "In the open, in your true colours, as you really are, but no stepfather to hide behind now. You'll kick on air before I'm through with you." I suspect that Brandt had been wavering, stunned by the enormity of it all, but now he moved forward, hand out. "Give it to me, Steiner." Steiner looked him full in the face for a long time, then passed the Luger over, butt first. Brandt's next words wiped the triumphant smile from Radl's face. "Sergeant Major Steiner is acting under my orders, Colonel Radl. I am in command here now." "Are you mad, Brandt?" Radl demanded. "On whose authority?" "My own. I consider that you have failed to carry out your duties in a manner consistent with your responsibilities as a German officer. I therefore assume command, as is my right, and am prepared to defend such action before any necessary court-martial. You will consider yourself under arrest." Radl laughed wildly. "And you think I will sit still and say nothing?" "If you do not, I will shoot you." Brandt turned to the rest of us. "It would be wiser to allow things to appear as normal as possible. I shall stay here with Colonel Radl. Sooner the rest of you get to work, the better. You, Schellenberg, will be nominally in charge." "I warn you, Brandt, for the last time," Radl said. "And I warn you, Colonel Radl, any kind of a wrong move and I put a bullet into you. You will now oblige me by returning to the dining room." Radl threw his napkin on the floor and swung on his heel. Brandt followed him
and paused at the door. He took the key to the leg irons from his pocket and threw it to me. Schellenberg formulated a complete plan of action in the 5 minutes it took us to reach the harbour. By his reckoning, there were about 120 men who could lay his hands on without delay. Tote workers and pioneers in the main, with a few artillerymen thrown in, plus the rest of us. There were plenty of tools and ropes in his equipment store near the south landing stage, and 3 heavy trucks we could use. Getting everyone to really pull together, Germans and tote workers alike, was something else again, which was where Steiner came in. He had to shout to make himself heard, and he kept it short. "There's a lifeboat at Granville. If we can get it down here and launched into the harbour, maybe we can do something for those poor devils out there. If we can't, then they drown. Nothing else for it." Support for Steiner came from the most unexpected of quarters. Fitzgerald clambered up on the tailboard and turned to face the motley gathering. "You all know me. I'm an American. When that lifeboat leaves the harbour, my men will be part of its crew, along with Colonel Morgan and Mr. Scully, who are English, and Sergeant Major Steiner and his men, who are German. Men are dying out there. Who they are doesn't matter. Now shut your mouths and get on board the trucks." And it worked. I was one of those in the field car which brought up the rear of the small convoy. As we moved away, a fishing boat lost its moorings and was pounded in against the breakwater, the hull splintering instantly. I hoped it wasn't an omen. The boathouse had been constructed of pre-stressed concrete slabs. Schellenberg sent 6 pioneers inside under Sergeant Schmidt, armed with 10-pound hammers, and they simply smashed out the panels of the rear wall in a sustained barrage that lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes. The Owen Morgan stood exposed for all to see, trim and beautiful in her blue and white paint, mounted on her launching carriage. Ezra took charge, indicating where he wanted to have the lines fixed. The ropes were thrown out. Willing hands seized them. The Owen Morgan weighed 15 tons, which was enough to haul up the narrow street. When she moved out into the rain, Ezra standing in the prow, there was a great cheer, but at once it became obvious that she would never be able to negotiate the turning at the top of the lane. "That cottage on the corner!" shouted Ezra. "Have it down!" 50 or 60 men swarmed over it with crowbars, pickaxes, and hammers. The front wall caved in. The boat was eased round into the next lane. There was a garden on that corner, fronted by a 5-foot wall. Schellenberg was already at work with another gang, and the wall was flattened to the ground by the time we got there. The main difficulty from that point was the steepness of the road up to the seigneurie. It was awash in the heavy rain, the surface crumbling so that it was impossible for the trucks to operate at all. They moved on ahead, and everyone who was able laid hands on the ropes and hauled. We came abreast of the seigneurie and stopped pulling. The trucks maneuvered into position and the lines were hooked up quickly. Then the lines tightened as the trucks started to move ahead slowly. From then on, it was comparatively easy. The excitement by now was intense and rose to fever pitch when we moved past the airstrip and started down the hill towards Charlottetown. We ran the lifeboat close enough to one of the trucks for her prow to touch the tailboard and started down, everyone hanging onto the lines for dear life to stop her from running away. When we reached the waterfront, we pulled her free of the truck and took her down the main access road to the lower jetty by hand. At the far end, by the south landing stage, a stone slipway slid under the heaving waters. Steiner and the Brandenburgers joined Ezra on board. Then we ran her down and into the water and tied her up. Schellenberg had them roll drums of petrol down from the main store, and he and Captain Varga saw to it that the tanks were filled. It was a big moment when Ezra got to work, and the engines fired. Including Ezra, there were 11 of us in the crew. Ezra produced RNLI, yellow oilskins, and life jackets for everyone. I acted as second coxswain and relayed Ezra's orders. We cast off and moved away from the jetty. Steiner was acting as bowman on my suggestion, and Fitzgerald was amidships. When we moved past the breakwater, the wind had reached hurricane force, and the seas could only be described as mountainous. In these conditions, it is not to be wondered that I saw fear on the faces around me.
We took water constantly, great green sheets washing in from stem to stern, and for a while there was a genuine struggle for survival. Ezra had opened the side window of the wheelhouse, and now he leaned out and called to me, "See to it that every man is on a lifeline, Owen! This lot will get worse before it gets better!" I should have thought of it earlier, although for various reasons lifelines are not habitually used by lifeboatmen. I started to work my way round, checking on everyone. Steiner was in the front cockpit with Lanz, Obermeier, and Schreiber. Lanz was being very sick, and Schreiber looked terrified. I shouted instructions in Steiner's ear. He nodded and saw to Schreiber's lifeline himself. I pulled my way back along the deck to the rear cockpit where most of the others were, and paused by the wheelhouse window to speak to Ezra. It all happened so fast. It was a combination of things. The size of the seas and the force of the wind striking us so hard as we teetered on the crest of a mountainous wave that the Owen Morgan sheered as it went down. The next wave struck hard on the starboard bow, and we capsized. I heard a desperate cry, a great roaring, and held on to the open window of the wheelhouse for dear life. World was green water washing over me, salt in the eyes and mouth, filling the nostrils, and unbearable weight. We were half under, and still driving on, the engines never faltering in their watertight compartments. I started to choke, and then broke through to the surface, taking in great lungfuls of air as we slowly righted ourselves. Ezra, sou'wester gone, was still hanging on to the wheel. Fitzgerald was safe, together with Grant and Hagan, but Wallace was missing. I forced my way along to the forward cockpit to discover that Schreiber had gone also. His line having parted, there was nothing we could do. Perhaps 20 minutes after the capsizing, we paused for a brief moment on top of an enormous wave and saw the pinnacles about 300 yards away. The Pride of Hamburg was hard on, her stern under the water. Ezra had no choice but to make his first run in to the starboard side, due to the manner in which she had gone on the reef. There were men hanging on in various places, though not as many as I'd expected. It was only later that I discovered that 23 of her complement of 48 passengers and crew were already dead, including the captain. Some washed overboard when she struck, and others drowned when the only lifeboat had been overwhelmed by that terrible sea. There was a ladder in her waist, down which the crew would have to come, one by one, to jump. Ezra went in from up tide to leeward, allowing the tidal current to carry us in. There were already a couple of men on the jumping ladder well above us, but as another wave lifted us up, we were suddenly virtually level. Sergeant Lantz and Fitzgerald were at the rail and caught both men as they jumped. As another wave hammered us in against the hull of the Pride of Hamburg, 3 more started down the ladder. I got a glimpse of Steiner leaning over the rail, waved, and then the first one jumped. Grant caught him and pulled him down into the cockpit. The second hesitated, then followed. He had left it too late. We dropped 15 feet as the wave receded, and he landed heavily on top of the wheelhouse with a cry of agony. The third man hung onto the ladder with both hands, even when we rose to his level, and stayed there for a long moment, so that he could have stepped over our rail with no difficulty. He had obviously lost his nerve. Fitzgerald, the next time we moved up again, grabbed him with both hands to pull him in by force. The man held on tight. A wave pulled the lifeboat 20 feet away from the hull, and Fitzgerald, refusing to let go, was dragged over the side. He managed to grab the ladder and hung there, just below the man he was trying to save, who scrambled up the rail and climbed over. A moment later, it happened. My father all over again. A sudden cross-current caught us hard on, swinging us back against the Pride of Hamburg, trapping Fitzgerald's legs between our rail and the ladder. A cry of agony rose above the storm, and Steiner was over the rail and grabbing for him in the moment that we started to sheer off. Steiner caught him with one hand and hung on to the top rung of the ladder, but it wasn't enough, and as Fitzgerald started to go, I ran for the rail and jumped. I caught the bottom rung of the ladder in the trough of a wave. The next one floated me up to Fitzgerald's level, and I grabbed for the ladder and got an arm around him. Somehow, we got him over the rail. He was in a sorry way. Both legs obviously crushed, but at least he was unconscious. We got an arm each and dragged him up the sloping deck, and Steiner kicked open the first door we came to. It was some sort of a saloon with a bar at one end and padded seats, tables bolted to the floor. A German naval officer was wedged behind one of them. He was in full uniform, including his cap, and it didn't need all the gold braid or the rows of medal ribbons to tell me that this man was Korvettenkapitän Karl Olbricht. He was wearing a spinal brace, his chin held firmly in a kind of aluminium cup. I kicked the door shut, and the comparative quiet was uncanny. "Come in, gentlemen," Albrecht said in German. He was obviously half drunk. "Forgive me for not standing up, but unfortunately my spine and one leg are supported by steel contraptions of one kind or another. It makes life difficult enough at best of times." "Captain Albrecht," Steiner said. "Sergeant Major Steiner, Brandenburg Division. This gentleman is Colonel Morgan, a British officer. We came in the lifeboat from St. Pierre." Albrecht stared at me owlishly. "British? So we have lost the war?" "It would take too long to explain. This is an American officer, Major Fitzgerald. He's been badly hurt. We'll have to leave him with you till we see what's happening out there." When we went out on deck, the Owen Morgan was circling and turning in below the stern of the Pride of Hamburg, which, as I have said, was under water. I suddenly realized what Ezra was going to try, a truly desperate stratagem, but one which might just work. He drove her straight in across the stern rail until his prow rested on the deck and held her in place with his engines. The men of the Pride of Hamburg went sliding down to the stern on their back sides. I watched 5 or 6 of them scramble over the rail into the lifeboat, and then the sea pulled it out again. The tide was falling fast now, and I noticed the top of the stern rail show above the water where it had been covered earlier. Ezra would not have much longer. He brought the Owen Morgan in again, driving her up on the deck, and another half-dozen were pulled to safety. That only left 3 waiting down there waist-deep in water as he prepared to come in again. I grabbed Steiner's arm and cried, "Better get Fitzgerald, we haven't got long." We returned to the lounge. Fitzgerald was still unconscious, and Albrecht looked drunker than ever. I told Steiner, "We'll get Fitzgerald to safety and come back for him." We lifted the American between us and went out on deck. The lifeboat still waited, and as we started down, I saw Grant coming up the slope towards us. Several things seemed to happen at once. A great sea rolled in and rocked the Pride of Hamburg so that the deck inclined even more, and we lost our balance. I was close to the rail and managed to grab hold with one hand and hang on to Fitzgerald with the other. Steiner went headlong down the slope and over the stern rail to join Grant, who was already in the water. The Owen Morgan had been pulled out again, and Ezra fought to hold her with his engines 20 yards from the stern. Both Grant and Steiner were carried alongside, and lines snaked out as the crew rushed to rescue them. I got my hands onto Fitzgerald's armpits and started to move back up the sloping deck to my rear. I got the door of the saloon open and pulled him inside. Albrecht was exactly where we had left him. "Thought you were leaving," he commented. "So did I." I arranged cushions on the floor as a rough mattress, eased Fitzgerald onto it, and went back outside. Ezra had sheered off a good 50 yards, and I knew why. Now that the tide was really ebbing, jagged rocks were exposed on either side, a death trap waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to venture in, and Ezra Scully was no fool. He waved from the wheelhouse. I waved back. Then the Owen Morgan turned and started to make her slow and painful journey back to St. Pierre. When I went back into the saloon, Fitzgerald moaned. I took out my knife and cut open his trousers from knee to ankle. What I discovered was anything but pleasant. "He is not good, your friend?" Albrecht asked. "The captain's cabin is through there." He nodded towards the inner door. "End of the passage. There should be a medical kit of some description." The cabin was a shambles. The first worthwhile find I made was a pair of binoculars in a leather case. I found a first aid case of polished wood inside a locker above the bunk. I was hoping for a painkiller and found what I was seeking in a narrow metal tray, a row of small glass ampoules of some kind of morphine derivative, each one a simple hypo. I returned to the saloon and jabbed a couple into Fitzgerald's left arm, and got more cushions and tried to make him as comfortable as possible. I said to Albrecht, "I'm going on deck. I want to see if the lifeboat can make it into Charlottetown. If you wouldn't mind passing me a bottle of something from behind the bar, I think I might survive." He smiled wryly. I took him a bottle of rum, and he thanked me gravely, pulled out the cork with his teeth, and drank from the bottle. I left him and went outside. When I opened the door, the wind snatched at me with a solid pounding force, and spray cascaded across the rail. I looked over the side into a sprawling morass of jagged black rocks and white water. Beyond, the sea lifted in one enormous wave after another, all the way to Saint-Pierre. The binoculars were excellent. I found the Owen Morgan about a quarter of a mile from the Pride of Hamburg when she rose out of nowhere on the crest of a wave. I stayed at the rail for the next hour, staying with her every inch of that painful way. The worst moment came when she was no more than a couple of 100 yards from the breakwater. The wind caught the Owen Morgan savagely on top of a great wave. She broached, and another enormous wave carried her in sideways towards the end of the breakwater. Miraculously her head came round, and in my mind's eye I saw Ezra fighting for control. At the last moment, fate, or the lesser gods, relented. I saw her top a final wave, then flow down into harbour and disappear behind the breakwater. I returned to the saloon, and searching again among the bottles behind the bar, found unbelievably a bottle of Haig and Haig. Officer stock indeed. I slithered down to Fitzgerald. He was still unconscious, but seemed quieter, so I scrambled across to where Albrecht sat. "They made it," I said. "I saw them enter harbour." "Remarkable." He was halfway down the bottle. "Are they likely to be back?" "Oh, I should think so, but they'll have to wait for the next tide. We can expect them at any time after 4 in the morning." Fitzgerald moaned and opened his eyes. I edged across to him. "How do you feel?" He stared at me blankly, sweat on his face, then smiled. "Hello, Owen," he said weakly. "What happened?" "You got yourself smashed up." He nodded. "I remember now. My legs. I can't feel anything. They don't even seem to be there." "Which isn't surprising," I said. "I've filled you full of morphine. Now, be quiet. Take it easy." Closed his eyes, then opened them again. "You know, being out there in the Owen Morgan was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. I wouldn't have missed it for—" He couldn't finish the sentence, and his eyes closed. "Dead?" Albrecht inquired. "No, not yet." I went out on deck. Water only touched the ship's hull when it was blown in by the wind, for by now a great deal more of the reef was exposed at a steep angle on a bed of jagged rocks. The danger point was going to be when the tide started to come in again. I'd seen wrecks on the pinnacles one day, and gone the next, too often for comfort. I forced my way into what was left of the chart room, and salvaged a lantern and signalling lamp. It was late evening now, darkness moving in from the horizon, and still those mountainous seas rolled between us and the island. I lit the lantern and hung it on a hook. Albrecht smiled. "A little light about the dark. You tell me about the war, by the way. Is this over, then?" "As good as." I arranged a few more seat cushions on the floor beside Fitzgerald and lay down. I was overwhelmingly tired. I closed my eyes, intending to rest them for just a little while, and plunged into sleep. I came awake to a terrible groan, and found Fitzgerald struggling to sit up. "Oh, I've never known such pain. Oh, I've never known such pain." "Hang on," I said. "I'll fix it in a minute." I got the other ampoule from the box and jabbed it into him. It seemed to take effect almost at once, and I could see the strain ebbing from his face. I glanced at my watch and saw with some surprise that it was 2:30 in the morning. He spoke so softly that I had to put my ear close to his lips to hear what was said. "Glad I came, Morgan. Heroes, all of them. Proud to have served with them. No regrets." That was more, but so garbled as not to make any kind of sense. About 5 minutes later, died. Albrecht's face was grave in the lamplight. "What and how?" I reached for the signalling lamp. "I'm going to try to make some kind of contact with the shore, and I want to see what the weather is like." It had stopped raining, and a full moon floated in the sky of dark blue velvet studded with brilliant ice-cold stars. The wind had abated considerably, but a moderate gale was still blowing. The island was shrouded in darkness. There was no sign of a light, which surprised me, for it seemed likely that Ezra would have started by now, and the Owen Morgan was equipped with an electric searchlight. I used the signalling lamp intermittently for 20 minutes or so. When I finally stopped, I knew in my heart that we were in trouble. The rocks were covered again now, and the sea was slapping in against the Pride of Hamburg's hull, pushing at the stern, and the ship groaned uneasily.
I stayed there in the darkness as a cloud obscured the moon, listening to the great rushing sound of the middle race, feeling the deck vibrate under my feet, and knew with complete and utter certainty that there would come one final moment when the Pride of Hamburg would be pushed from the reef and swallowed up as assuredly as if she had never existed. I went into the saloon, and Albrecht said, "They are coming, are they?" I shook my head, and he swallowed what was left of the rum in his bottle and sighed. "You know, I never did really fancy the idea of going down with a ship. I'm with you all the way there. Have another look. They can't leave us here like this," he said. I think I knew what was in his mind, but went away. The sound of the shot came as no surprise. The ship was moving slightly from side to side now, and suddenly lurched so savagely that for a terrible moment I thought that she might turn right over, taking me with her. I had only one chance, and that a small one. It was based on the fact that the flow of the mill race ran directly from the pinnacles towards the island. I returned to the saloon and approached Fitzgerald. It was his life jacket I was after. I got it off without too much difficulty and lashed it around my own. Albrecht had fallen forward across the table, and the back of his skull was not a pleasant sight. I moved up the sloping floor and groped behind the bar among the bottles for something worth drinking. I went back on deck, clutching the first bottle I had laid hand to, and pulled the cork with my teeth. It was a schnapps. I stood at the rail and got as much of it down as I could. About half was all I could take, and when I tossed the bottle into the sea, my belly was on fire. I had kept all my clothes on by design, and now I picked up the signal lamp and sent a short final message in straight Morse. "Ship going now. Will have to swim for it. Morgan." I pulled my eye patch down around my neck on its elastic band, tossed the lamp over the rail into the sea, and jumped after it. I was sucked into the mill race and carried along at a terrific rate. I would say that the current must have been running at 9 or 10 knots, for the distance I covered within a few minutes was phenomenal. The moon was hard and bright above, and when I rose on the crest of a wave, I could see Fort Edward on the point above the harbour. Down I went into the valley again, caught in the current that bore me along as helplessly as a wooden spar. In the east, the edge of night was touched with light. Another great sea lifted me high, and I caught a last glimpse of the Pride of Hamburg still fast on the pinnacles, and then, beyond her, a wall of white water rolled in from the Atlantic. It washed the reef in an enormous curtain of spray, and when it cleared, the Pride of Hamburg had disappeared forever. Time really did cease to exist then, as I let the current take me where it wanted. On another occasion, it had carried me in to Steiner's Beach, but would it now? If I missed, if I was on the outer edge of the current, I would be carried past the southeast corner of the island, and Brittany was a hell of a sight further on. I'd reach it all right, but at some future date, and fit only for fish bait. I was tired, completely at the end of my tether. My head lolled forward, and then lifted high on a wave, I looked across the ragged white carpet of surf to the cliffs, black in the grey dawning, and saw beneath them the beach, Steiner's Beach. A voice called my name, high and clear, like a distant trumpet echoing from the past, from childhood. Was it then, or now? I went under, struggled to the surface again, and another wave lifted me high so that I saw her sharp and clear, thigh-deep in water, hair blowing in the wind, Simone waiting for me, waiting for the mill race to bring me in, as it had brought us in together so long ago. The sea was in my ears, inside my head. My hands clawed at a waterfall of gravel. The sea came in again, flailing my body, trying to draw me back. I clawed frantically and found a hand that gripped mine with the strength of iron fused on iron. I was on my front, and someone seemed to be hitting me with a hammer between the shoulder blades. I kept on coughing, and then vomited a great quantity of water. After a while, I managed to croak, all right, enough. I'll live." I turned, and Simone, who was on her knees beside me, flung her arms round my neck. "Thank God, Owen. I knew you would try the mill race. Paddy and Ezra wouldn't believe it possible, but I knew you would try."
They were crouched on the other side of me, and Ezra passed a flask across. "I saw your signal, but they wouldn't let me reply." I stared at him blankly, and Paddy said, "Ardle killed Major Brant at the rectory late yesterday afternoon. We don't know how. He was waiting at the jetty with his SS when the lifeboat came in." "Which was why we couldn't come back for you, lad," Ezra explained. I struggled up. "And Steiner?" "Ardle's going to hang him from the old beech tree by the church gate for the whole world to see." "When?" "It's fixed for 8 o'clock. Riley glanced at his watch. "Which gives him about an hour." No bodies floated into the beach below as I scrambled down the face of the cliff above Horseshoe, but otherwise things were exactly as they had been on that first morning. It was raining steadily, and Fort Victoria was barely visible in the dawn mist. I found my reefer coat at the back of the crevasse where I had left it, and the Mauser with the SS bulbous silencer in the pocket. I pulled on the reefer coat and the old boatswain's cap I had stuffed into the pocket. I scrambled back up the cliff to where Paddy Riley's old car was parked. He was inside with Simon. Ezra stood in the rain, filling his old pipe. "Found what you wanted, then?" he commented. "Your dad's old coat, isn't it?" "That's right, Ezra." I took the Mauser from my pocket, pulled the clip from the butt, and emptied it. There were 7 rounds left. I reloaded it carefully, then rammed the clip back into the butt. "Not thinking of taking on the whole bloody world, then, are you, with that?" he said. "If necessary." "Be sensible, lad. Ardle's got 22 SS paratroopers down there." "Suicide for you to go down to Charlottetown now, Owen," Paddy Riley put in. "Ardle thinks you're dead, which at least gives you a chance to keep on living." "Interesting observation," I said. "Reminds me of a story I once heard about a respectable 45-year-old Dublin physician who spent his spare time back in 1920 as medical officer to an IRA flying column in Connemara." He raised a hand defensively. All right, I surrender, but only if I can play too." He opened the Gladstone bag at his feet and produced an old-fashioned British service revolver. "I've had this around for a hell of a long while, Owen. Time I put it to use again." "You must be mad, both of you," Ezra said. "The odds are impossible." "You're quite right," I nodded. "Now let's get down to Charlestown and see what's happening." Which all had a nice, confident ring to it. For a while there, I almost had myself believing it. Just past the airstrip on the other side of the road, there was the main water tower standing on the crest of the hill above Charlottetown. From there, the view was panoramic. Riley had a pair of excellent Zeiss glasses in the car. He got them out and passed them across. The church and the cemetery jumped into view. There was at least 150 tote workers in several long lines against the wall. In front of them, 40 or 50 pioneers were drawn up, all with rifles. Sergeant Schmidt was out in front, wearing a sidearm, which made me wonder about Schellenberg. I soon found him. He was standing beside Grant and Hagen, the 2 surviving Rangers, and there was an SS man to each of them, holding a machine pistol. I searched for the Brandenburgers and found Lantz, Obermeyer, and Hildorf standing at the main gate, guarded by 3 military policemen. There was no sign of Steiner, but everyone was obviously waiting for something, presumably Ardle's arrival, and the great double iron gates already stood wide. The old Westminster Bank building that housed the Platzkommandantur backed onto the cemetery. The first-floor windows of the house next to it, the signals headquarters, were open and provided a grandstand view. Through the field glasses I could see a couple of soldiers watching. When I lowered the glasses, Simon took them from me. "The signals headquarters next to the Platzkommandantur," I said. "What's it like inside?" "It's the old Grouville house," Paddy told me. "What's it like now?" I demanded. "I've been in a time or two," Ezra said. "Downstairs is sleeping quarters. Radio room in what used to be the drawing room on the first floor at the back of the house overlooking the churchyard." "How many men?" "Sometimes only the duty operator, but I've known 3 or 4 to be in there on occasion. Why?" Simone gave a sudden gasp, and I took the glasses from her and focused them. Steiner was being marched in through the gates between 2 SS men. They came to a halt beneath the beech tree. It was exactly 10 minutes to 8. I said, "Get me down to that signals headquarters as fast as you like, and I'll explain what we do on the way." I got on the floor in the rear. Simon covered me with an old blanket, and we set off. When we braked to a halt, Ezra got out first, and then Simon. There was a pause, and then Riley whispered, "Quick as you like, Owen." I went out crouching and found Ezra in the porch of the old Courville house, holding the door open. I went through into the hall, the Mauser ready against my thigh. It was dark and gloomy. Signs of military occupation were everywhere. I went up the stairs cautiously, Riley and Ezra behind, telling Simon to stay in the hall. Riley had the old 45 ready in his hand. I opened the door gently and stepped into the room. There was a bank of radio equipment to one side, an operator on duty in headphones. A signals sergeant stood peering out of the window, an SS man with him, a Schmeisser submachine gun slung from his shoulder. The wireless operator saw me first. His eyes widened, and I put a finger to my lips and brought up the Mauser. I tiptoed forward and touched its cold muzzle to the back of the SS man's neck. He stiffened, and I reached over and eased the Schmeisser from his shoulder. I gave it to Ezra and stepped back. "Turn round, both of you, and move away from the window." They did exactly as they were told. "Against the wall," I said, and outside there was the sound of a car. Riley glanced out of the window. "Radl's just arriving." The Mercedes had halted just inside the gate, and Radl was standing up in the back seat. He was in his best uniform. "Can you get him from here?" Riley demanded. "I should imagine so." The wireless operator jumped up and said, "Please, Colonel Morgan, don't kill us. It would be foolish. The war is almost over. They've arranged a meeting to discuss terms at Lüneburg." "Shut your mouth," the SS man ordered. "But it is true. I've just heard the news bulletin put out by the BBC." And there was my answer, so simple, so beautifully simple. I turned to the signals sergeant. "Lean out of that window right now and tell them that the war is over, that it's just come in over the radio from Guernsey. Top of your voice, so everyone can hear." The SS man obliged me by choosing that precise moment to jump for another Schmeisser hanging from a peg behind the door. I shot him in the back of the head. The sergeant turned, sick and frightened, and stumbled to the window. They had the rope around Steiner's neck and were about to throw the other end over the branch 20 feet above. As I moved in behind the signal sergeant, a diversion came from a completely unexpected source. Simone appeared in the main gateway. She saw Steiner and gave a terrible cry. Everyone turned as she ran past the Mercedes. She'd almost got to Steiner when one of the SS guards reached her. He struck her in the face with his clenched fist, knocking her to the ground. There was not a man there, German or otherwise, who had not received some kindness from her, if only in words. There was a sudden angry roar. Not only the tote workers surged forwards, but the pioneers and artillerymen too. Radl shouted, trying to make himself heard, and I knew that it was now or never. "Give me that damned cannon of yours," I said to Riley. I fired twice out of the window. The reports thundered across the churchyard and produced instant silence. Every face turned, and I rammed the barrel of the 45 into the back of the signal sergeant's skull, keeping well behind him. He did me proud. "The war!" he screamed. "The war is over! We have just received the news from Guernsey on the radio!" The silence continued for what seemed like an eternity, but an eternity which in reality lasted for no longer than 20 seconds. Then the crowd seemed to erupt into sound and action. Everyone seemed to move at once, the tote workers, the pioneers, all flooding across the churchyard through the gravestones to where Steiner stood beneath the tree. I could see the helmets of the SS guards here and there as they fought their way back towards Radl in the Mercedes at the gate. I don't know what happened then. Perhaps one of the SS men panicked. There was a sudden stutter of a machine pistol. The crowd scattered, leaving 3 of their number on the ground. One of them was a German, a pioneer, and the effect on his comrades was astonishing. Several of them raised their rifles and fired, and 2 of the SS men round Radl's car fell. Then Steiner ran through the crowd, waving his arms and calling to them. The pioneers lowered their rifles as he moved out into no man's land between the 2 sides. He stood, hands on hips, in direct confrontation with Radl in the back of the Mercedes, then turned to the crowd. "No more shooting! No more killing. It's all over. Don't you understand? We've survived the bloody war. All of us. Radl pulled out his Luger and shot him twice in the back. Everything happened at once after that. I leaned out of the window to get a shot at him and found the Mercedes already reversing through the gate, the SS paratroopers going back with it, firing steadily. I went out of the radio room on the run and took the stairs 3 at a time. The door to the street stood open, and as I reached the hall, the Mercedes lurched by, at least a dozen SS hanging on. Another 5 or 6 ran after it. I let them get past the door, then moved out, dropped to the cobbles, and started firing. I wasn't alone. Riley was on the ground beside me, the blast of his old 45 like the cannon at Waterloo, and Ezra stood by the porch, firing a Schmeisser. Confined in that narrow street, the SS who were on foot didn't stand a chance. As the Mercedes accelerated round the corner at the bottom, they turned, firing desperately, and went down within seconds. When I glanced back over my shoulder, I found that we had not been firing alone. Schellenberg was there, a rifle in his hands, at least a dozen pioneers at his back, together with 3 military police and the Brandenburgers, all carrying rifles. Paddy Riley was already running past them towards the churchyard, and I went after him. Steiner lay on his back, eyes fixed on some point high in the sky. There was blood soaking into the front of his tunic where one of the bullets had exited. Simon knelt beside him. I dropped to one knee beside Riley. "It's bad, Owen. They won't pretend otherwise." "Owen." Steiner's eyes flickered. "Owen, is that you?" I leaned over. As ever was Manfred, came floating in on the tide. His hand went to his throat, felt for the knight's cross, and tore it free. He held it out to me. "You, Owen, you've earned it. Look after Simon. Always that. Promise me." His eyes closed. His head went to one side. Simon fainted across him. A hand caught my shoulder and spun me round. I looked up into Grant's tortured face. "What happened to the Major?" "He died on the Pride of Hamburg before it went down," I told him. "He was badly injured. He needed a doctor, and there wasn't one there. I'm sorry. The pain in that great iron face was terrible to see." "We could have gone back, but Radl wouldn't let us." I moved on to the gate. They were all there by then. What was left of the Brandenburgers, Grant and Hagen, Schellenberg and his pioneers, Sergeant, Schmidt, policemen, all of them united in one respect, hatred of Radl. A pioneer corporal pushed through the crowd and saluted Schellenberg. He said, "They have taken the road to Fort Edward." Schellenberg turned to me. "Colonel Morgan, I now consider myself and my men to be under your command. What are your orders?" There was a silence. "Right, let's go and get the bastard," I said. At the top of the main street was the maintenance depot. We found arms in the ammunition store there, and commandeered a 3-ton truck and a half-track troop carrier with a heavy machine gun mounted in the back. My plan was to get after him fast and hit him hard before he could establish his defences. He had no more than 12 or 15 of his SS left now, but they were first-class fighting men, and rooting them out of the fort could prove a costly business. According to Schellenberg, there were no more than a dozen artillerymen on duty up there at the present time, which could have been worse, even if they did choose to obey Radl's orders, which was not only likely, but understandable. We braked to a halt just below the crest of the hill where the road lifted to the fort. The main gates were closed, and a couple of SS helmets showed above the sandbags of the machine-gun post outside. I thought about it for at least 10 seconds. The troop carrier goes in first. I want 3 men, 1 at the wheel and 2 on the machine-gun. Everyone else into the truck. Sergeant Schmidt, who had been driving the troop carrier, peered out through the open visor at me. "I might as well stay where I am. I know what I'm doing with these things." Lantz and Obermeyer had already taken their stations at the machine-gun, so there was really nothing to argue about. I got into the cab of the truck, beside Schellenberg, and we followed the troop carrier, allowing a 20-yard interval. Schmidt turned on the speed. The machine gun beside the gate started to fire when we still had 100 yards to go, but the troop carrier took the brunt, the bullets glancing harmlessly from its armor plating. The troop carrier hit the gates at something approaching 50 miles an hour, tearing them from their hinges. As we passed the machine-gun post, Schellenberg, who had been nursing a stick grenade, leaned out of the open window and dropped it onto the two pale faces dimly seen through the dust cloud. The explosion rocked the truck as we roared under the granite archway and bounced across the broken gates. The troop carrier swung broadside on. I saw Obermeyer go over the side, clutching a bloody face. Lance swung, working the machine-gun. There were men up on the rampart above the courtyard, SS by their helmets, firing furiously. A couple bounced down into the yard, and the troop carrier slowed and smashed into a truck that was parked by the steps on the other side. Our truck braked to a halt, and we all got out fast. I saw Hildorf run forward and get the side door of the troop carrier open. Lance had already dragged Schmidt from behind the wheel. He rolled him down to Hildorf and jumped after him. They got an arm each side and started to run for the shelter of the archway by the steps, and reached it with half a second to spare. The petrol tank of the troop carrier exploded like a bomb, showering burning fuel over a wide area. A dense pall of black smoke had drifted across the courtyard. I picked up a Schmeisser someone had dropped and went up the steps to the south rampart. I saw figures dimly through the smoke, fired, and kept on firing. Grant was at my shoulder, Hagen just behind him. As the clip emptied, a figure loomed out of the smoke, an SS sergeant, eyes rolling, teeth bared. I threw the Schmeisser into his face. Grant and Hagen fired at the same moment, driving him back into the smoke. I stumbled over the top step and found myself on another level, smoke eddying in the wind. I held the Mauser in my hand now. Hagen cried out and went down, and in his place was Schellenberg. The smoke cleared even more, and there were 3 of them, perhaps 10 yards from us. Schellenberg dropped to one knee, holding his Luger in both hands, firing coolly. There was only one figure there now, still coming on. I emptied the Mauser into him, saw him sway and fall, and then a great gust of wind blew in from the sea, dissolving the smoke like magic. I was on the final high point of the fort, and Radl stood there no more than 5 yards away. I went in on the run, but already I was too late. Radl's hand came up, holding a Luger. Then a strange thing happened. He recognized me, saw the dead walk before him, and the shock of it all was like a physical blow. He hesitated. The gutting knife was ready in my hand. As I swung, the blade jumped, catching him under the chin, shearing up through the roof of his mouth into the brain. He swayed there for a moment, then fell backwards across the low parapet, down to the sea, breaking in across those black rocks below. I cleaned the knife on my coat, closed it and put it in my pocket, then went down through the smoke and carnage to the courtyard. I found a field car down there and drove back to Charlottetown. The main street was crowded with tote workers and German troops wandering about aimlessly. I drove up past the church, slowly, and saw Ezra come out of the churchyard. He waved and ran towards me. "What happened up there?" I told him, but strangely enough he didn't seem all that interested. "I'm looking for Simone. She's disappeared. She came up to the hospital with us when we took Manfred, but she couldn't stand the waiting." I stared at him. "Are you telling me that Steiner is alive? Oh, he's in a bad way, all right, but it wasn't as final as it looked when Paddy got him on the slab. One bullet had gone straight through a lung, the other turned on his ribs. He lived. And Simone doesn't know this. God knows where she is now, poor child." But I did. I could see her at the edge of the water from the top of the cliffs, and I started down the path past the notice that warned of mines. Frankly, I don't know how I made it, because all of a sudden my limbs felt like rubber, and once or twice I stumbled and almost lost my balance. I dropped into the soft sand at the bottom of the path, rested for a minute or so, then got up and went towards her. She turned to meet me, her eyes swollen with weeping, and my heart went out to her. She came into my arms as she had done so many times before, and I smoothed her hair. "He's going to be all right, Simone." Her head came up slowly, eyes burning. "Manfred is alive. Are you telling me that Manfred is alive?" She pulled away and ran across the beach, stumbling in the loose sand, sobbing. I watched her scramble over the rocks to the bottom of the path and start to climb.
didn't feel anything like as bad as I had thought it would to see her go. I suppose in my heart I'd already got used to the idea. I thought of Mary Barton, and wanted her near me with an intensity that was something of a revelation. My hand went into my pocket and came out, holding the gutting knife. I sprang the blade and threw it out to sea with all my strength. It glinted once, then disappeared into those grey waters forever. A storm petrel cried harshly as it dipped above my head and flew away. I walked back across the sands and slowly, very slowly, started to climb.